All right. Thank you to everybody again who's joining. We still have a number of people in the waiting room coming through. We're going to give people just one more minute and then we will get started. We have a full and packed agenda today, so really appreciate everyone taking the time to be with us for our fourth and final quarterly meeting of the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program, Technical Advisory Council. A reminder for our council members who are on the line, we are, as you are entering in, we are going in and not renaming, I made this mistake again earlier. We are just adding TAC after your name so that we can easily see you all and so that the members of the public also know who all is on the council. So if you see that added to your name, don't be surprised. We're just going in and adding that in. So Juliet, maybe if you can, I think we have a couple people in the waiting room here. We'll let them in and then get going, I think.
They're in and we have a quorum.
Wonderful, great. Thank you, Juliet. Okay, well, we will kick this off. Thank you all again for joining the fourth quarterly meeting of the 2020 for the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Programs Technical Advisory Council. We really appreciate everybody taking the time to be with us today. We know this is a long virtual Zoom meeting and know that, that takes an extra amount of energy these days with the level of Zoom fatigue out there. So I really appreciate everybody taking the time. Really looking forward to today's conversation. We have as I mentioned before, a packed agenda with a lot of things to talk through here today and to present on. And I want to thank all of our guests and speakers who have joined here to join the conversation today. I also want to thank all of our council members for your support and dedication to our work over this just unprecedented year, and really appreciate all that every one of you do to support California communities and Californians and in all the work that you do. So a very sincere thank you to everybody for everything you do every day, even though we only get to come together a few times a year. We really appreciate it. So just a couple quick remarks here just to go through the agenda, and then we'll go through some of the technical logistics here. As I mentioned, this is our fourth quarterly meeting. We are hoping that at some point in 2021, we might be able to come back together for in-person meetings at some point. So we'll, hoping that comes through in the new year at some point. But for today's agenda, we've got this slide up here on the screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. We will go through, first we'll go through roll call as we always do, and then approval of the draft minutes. We are bringing back a number of things from our previous meetings as we've been working to prep for this meeting. So one of those is a state agency report out. Each of the state agency members of the council will provide an update on some key priorities, as well as work that's going on across the state agencies and work in resilience. And then we'll have time for discussion and public comment. We will then be joined by OPR to a presentation from our colleagues at OPR, Eric DeCock and Beth, who have just done tremendous work to update OPR's wildfire planning technical assistance advisory guidance. So we will be hearing from them on that. We are going to take a break today. We are looking to have that break be from 12 to 1. Hopefully we'll stay on track and be able to hit that time, but just so everybody knows, we'll take that break so people can have lunch, step away from the screen, take care of what you need to. And then when we come back, we will do a deeper conversation around the council's work group work that has been going on. We've talked about both of the work groups at previous meetings, but are excited to really be getting those going again after some staff and many transitions over this year, staffing and other transitions this year. So as we do, we will take public comment after each agenda item, as part of each agenda item, and then we will have a general public comment period at the end of the meeting. A couple administrative kind of logistics Zoom things to walk through. As I mentioned earlier, please keep your line muted if you're not speaking, just to avoid background noise. We also ask that when you are speaking, just given the time we have here together in the packed day, to please keep your remarks concise so that we can be respectful of our shared time together. We definitely understand this is a full, long day. If you need to take breaks, please feel free. If you need to turn your camera off, we absolutely understand. When you are able, we do ask, especially for our council members, to keep your camera on so we can engage in conversation as much as possible. For council members, if you would like to make comment or speak when we get to the discussion portion, we do ask that you please raise your hand. It helps us keep a queue of who wants to talk. So we do ask that you use the raise hand feature. If you go to the participants button at the bottom of the screen and hover over your name, you'll see the option to be able to raise your hand. We will track those, and Juliet, who's on the line, and Taylor, who will join us in a little bit, will help keep track of that. I've already talked about adding the TAC to the end of the council member names. And I think that does it for the logistics. So now we will go to roll call. So I'm going to list council member names. If you're here, please unmute and let us know. So Jacob Alvarez.
Present.
Carolee
Here.
Tom Collishaw. Tina Curry.
Here.
Grant Davis.
Here.
Great. Laura Engemann. I saw Laura.
Here.
Janna Gannon.
Here.
Jason Greenspan.
Here.
Amanda Hansen.
Here.
Great, thanks. David Loya.
Here I am.
Dan McDonald.
Here.
Sona Mona.
Here.
Darwin Musavi.
Here.
Andrea House.
Here.
Jonathan Parfrey.
Present.
Michelle Pissarro.
Here.
Heather Rock.
Here.
And I think for Lauren Sanchez, we have Heather Hickerson, who's alternate for today.
Yes, here.
Thanks for joining. Mark Starr.
Here.
Well, Brian Strong.
Here. Good morning.
Morning. Gloria Walton.
Good morning. Here.
Morning. John Wentworth. I think John might be joining a little bit later, and Wilma Wooten. All right, well, thank you all very much for joining here today. So with that, we're going to move to approval of the draft minutes. Somehow we neglected to approve the June 26 meetings and our October meeting. So today we have the exciting opportunity to approve both. The minutes are up and posted on the website, so hopefully people have had a chance to look at those. Are there any comments or proposed edits, corrections to the minutes?
Now, can we approve them both in one motion?
Yeah, what I will do is I will ask for people to, yes, we can do that, approve them both. I will just ask people to verbally, because we have to track for the minutes, say yay or nay for both at the same time. So that's great. So would anybody move to approve the minutes? Do we have a motion?
So moved. This is Brian.
All right, and a second?
Second.
Sorry, was that Andrea? Great, from the second, okay. So I'm going to go through in the virtual space here and just run through everybody's names, and then please just indicate a yes, no, or abstention for both the June and October minutes. So Jacob Alvarez,
Yes,
yes for both June and October.
that's correct.
Carolee Brown,
Yes for June, yes for October.
thank you. Tom is not here. Tina Curry,
Yes, for both.
okay, thank you. Grant Davis,
Yes, for both.
Laura Engemann,
Abstention for June, I believe, and then yes for October.
right, thank you. Janna Gannon,
Yes for both.
Jason Greenspan,
Yes, for both.
thank you. Amanda Hanson,
Yes for both.
David Loya,
Yes, for both.
Dan McDonald,
Yes, for both.
Sona Mona,
Yes for both.
Darwin Musavi.
Yes for June and abstention for October.
Great, okay. Jonathan Parfrey,
I and I.
thank you. Michelle Pissarro,
Abstention for June and yes for October.
okay. Heather Brock,
Yes for June, abstention for October.
okay. And then Heather,
Abstention for both.
okay. And Mark Starr,
Yes, for both.
Brian Strong,
Yes, for both.
Gloria Walton,
Yes for both.
John Wentworth in case he's joined. Okay. Wilma Wooten, nope. And it looks like maybe I've missed Andrea. Did I miss calling on you, Andrea?
Yeah, but that's okay.
Okay.
Yes to both.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else who I neglected to call on from the council? Okay, great. Thank you. It's always the most exciting part of our meetings. Okay, now we will move on to the state agency report outs. Very excited to be able to bring these back, and we know 2021 is going to be a very busy year for all of us. Excited to ask each of our state colleagues here to give a report out, both on work that has been underway since our last convening, and then also any priorities as we head into the next year. So maybe I will start with Tina Curry from Cal OES.
Great. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all, at least virtually. So a few things going on with Cal OES. Like most of us in everywhere, COVID is top item. We've been involved in the response from the beginning, and our state operations center, in fact, has been for like 270 days. Continue, of course, the vaccination effort and the ongoing work. So there's no doubt that that activation will span a year or more. And many state agencies are supporting. Everybody, of course, is affected. Each person in California, but also all the levels of government. So we're all in a team effort in very unprecedented circumstances. And I'm sure Mark Starr will talk more about the ongoing COVID response, but just wanted, that's a very important activity for our office as well. In the middle of the California unprecedented fire season, about over 4 million acres burned. It's interesting, something we thought about and planned for, and then of course ultimately had to execute everything from sheltering people in hotels.
Tina, I'm not sure.
Instead of congregate settings to
Tina,
managing fire operations with COVID protocols.
Sorry, Tina, I'm not sure if it's just on my end, but I
Sorry,
think you're.
am I broken up?
The lag, yeah, or you're breaking up a little bit. So
Okay.
apologies. I know people would want to hear what you're
Okay, I don't know if I could do anything about that, if it's
Well, maybe what we'll
having
do,
technical problems, so maybe we could.
yeah, maybe I'll
um,
move over to Amanda, and then maybe it'll just magically fix itself. I don't know.
Okay,
We can come back to you. Sorry,
Sounds-
team.
Okay. Can you hear me, Nuantara? Uh-oh.
Yes.
You can? Okay, because Nuantara's face is frozen on my screen. God, this is fun. Okay. Let's see. Well, a lot has been going on within the Resources Agency. I'll just tick through a couple of top line things, and I'm sure more will come up throughout the day. But I'd say one of the bigger pieces that relate to resilience is the executive order that the governor issued in October, really committing to a really robust response to both the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis through accelerated actions, accelerated nature-based climate action. And this is really super exciting for the Resources Agency, where a lot of the work that we do really does drive on climate, both for carbon sequestration and also for building climate resilience. So there's a number of next steps that we are working to deliver on through this executive order. I'm just going to tick through the big ones, but the executive order establishes a state goal to conserve 30% of the state's lands and coastal waters. And I'm going to take a minute to be clear here, because I've actually told people the wrong thing, and I want to set the record straight. This is 30% of lands and 30% of coastal waters. So it's not 30% total, it's 30% each. So I just thought I'd clarify that, because I've probably created mass misinformation. So apologies for that. So 30% of our state's lands and coastal waters by 2030, with sort of a pathways document, sort of how will we do this? What's our approach? How are we going to define conservation due by February of 2022? And I would just flag that, we were pretty clear in the executive order that conservation, there's two things we're really trying to sort of break up with this executive order. The first is the notion that conserving land means people are not on that land. So we want to ensure that that is clear as an upfront administration philosophical boundary. And then the other piece is that we don't want to, we want to be clear that conservation also doesn't necessarily mean that you can't also be a working land. So there's many land management practices that land managers can undertake, whether they're farmers or foresters, that will absolutely drive on climate change and biodiversity, and those things can and will count. So the process to sort of get this rolling publicly will begin early next year. So more to come on that, and we're going to have I think the vision is really to, have a robust stakeholder engagement on the 30 by 30 goal. Another key deliverable coming out of that executive order is the call for a natural and working lands climate smart strategy. And this is really our intention with this document, is to clarify how it is that we are going to deliver accelerated action in this sector in the long term. And the pathways document, the climate smart land strategy and the 30 by 30 strategy are inherently very linked. And so we're going to be trying to make sure that as those documents move forward, it's done so in a super integrated way. So I'll stop there in the executive order, and I'm happy to answer any questions that may come up. But I'd also just like to flag some of the work that we've been doing internally to prepare for the release of an updated state adaptation strategy. Most, if not all of you, know that we are due for, they're due every 3 years to update the state's adaptation strategy, and the Resources Agency is statutorily required to coordinate this year, or for this update. We've been working really closely with Nuantara and her team to coordinate on the development of an approach for the strategy update for next year. And so really excited to work with this group and broader stakeholders to help deliver on that as a team. I think I'll just maybe stop there since I've done a lot of talking, and again, happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Amanda, appreciate that. I think just, sorry, a quick process note, we'll go through each of the state updates and then open it up for questions so that we've got plenty of time for discussion. So now I will go, maybe ask Darwin to go next.
Hi all, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, let me know at any point if I start cutting out. I was having some issues yesterday, so hopefully that doesn't come back to haunt me today as well. Morning, everyone. I'm Darwin Musavi, Deputy for Environmental Policy at the State Transportation Agency. I just want to give a couple quick updates on some of the work we've been doing around a set of different executive orders and the ones that Amanda was mentioning a second ago. We're currently in the midst of implementing the CalSTA portions of Governor's Executive Order EON 1919, which was the climate change executive order that came out in 2019, as well as the CalSTA portion of EO 7920, which is the executive order that came out this year that called for ambitious ZEV targets in 2035 and 2045. The CalSTA portions of both of those executive orders, however, are on the side of transportation infrastructure investments, and specifically call out the need to leverage over $5 billion of transportation infrastructure investments to meet climate change goals, both through reducing greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled associated with our transportation system, but also to prepare for the impacts of climate change that might be felt on the system. And so in doing so, we are putting together an action plan right now for implementation of how we'll be implementing those EOs. There's been a public process around that some of you may have been involved in. We'll be releasing a draft action plan in early 2021 with workshops to follow to gather further public input. But essentially, most of the actions we're looking at are really aimed at what can Caltrans and the California Transportation Commission both do, both in how they approach planning and then also programming of those projects to further account for both greenhouse gas emissions that come from projects and making sure that investments that we're building are considering physical climate risk associated to those investments. You know, this isn't something that's going to change overnight, obviously, but we're coming up with actions that will be a starting place to start better integrating that thinking into our work. And then the other kind of quick update I wanted to give everyone is part of the governor's effort to join the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. We are at CalSTA at the very early stages of exploring a potential for partnering with CCRI on looking at a California-based transportation case study to analyze asset level risk and do risk analysis at an asset level on a potential transportation project. So that's still just in the discussion phases, but that would be something that you all might be interested in. Happy to come back later when we have a little bit more to provide an update. And that's all I've got.
Great, thank you so much, Darwin. Next, I will ask Heather from EPA to give us an update.
Thanks, Ned and Tara. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to provide some updates from Cal EPA and our boards and departments. First, earlier this week, Governor Newsom announced appointments to the California Air Resources Board, including new leadership by Leanne Randolph as chair. And we are thrilled to welcome these new members to the California Climate and Clean Air team. And we will soon launching the process to update the scoping plan, which is going to chart a course to carbon neutrality by 2045. I also want to note that we are working on an update to CalEnviroScreen, which is the mapping tool that helps identify California communities that are most affected by many sources of pollution. We will be releasing a draft of that soon, followed by workshops and public comment, and we're looking to finalize that early next year. Lastly, I wanted to provide an update on the Water Board's activities. So the Water Board Division of Water Rights was directed in 2017 to identify data needs and make recommendations on regulatory and policy changes to account for climate change when conducting water availability analyses. The division has developed a report to assess issues and actions that could support an effective water rights response to climate change, with a focus on incorporating climate change into water rights permitting. The Water Board staff, we will plan to publicly release the report in late December or early January and present an informational item before the Water Board in mid-January. And the report and all of its resources will be posted to the division's climate change webpage as it becomes available. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Heather. Now I'll go to Mark Starr. Are you there? Oh, great.
All right, a little mute challenge there. Can you hear me okay? Thank you.
Yes.
So, good morning. I'm Mark Starr, representing the California Health and Human Services Agency. I'm Deputy Director for Environmental Health at the Department of Public Health. So just a couple quick announcements. Our Department of Public Health has a new director that was just announced and appointed by the governor, Dr. Tomas Aragon, and he is, we believe will start in January, early January, but don't have a fixed date yet. He's currently a health officer in San Francisco County, city and county. And I actually personally worked with him off and on over a couple decades, and he will be an excellent addition to our team. Very much proactive about public health issues and things of the futures and now, climate change, the pandemic, equity, and things like that. Just general COVID updates. As Tina Curry mentioned, we are all hands on deck in Department of Public Health and our agency on this as well. The current situation is quite concerning, as everyone knows who watches the news, so I won't go into details on that, but the levels of restriction now that are necessary, we hope that everyone will follow those and that we can move out of this huge surge that we're experiencing here this late season and winter. The good news, of course, is vaccine is coming. We don't want people to put too much emphasis on that, in the sense that all the precautions are needed, and vaccine will be generally available to the public for quite some time. So, and we don't know if the vaccine stops shedding either, so there'll be precautions needed for quite some time, as I mentioned. Our Office of Health Equity is, and our department as a whole is very involved in this response. We estimate that probably 50% of the department's staff are working on COVID activities one way or another. Some are redirected to a whole separate entity that's the response team. And then some are doing, like myself and Linda Helen and others in Office of Health Equity, that are working on COVID where we sit. So about 50% of our time. And so that's pretty much true across the board. Our climate team in the Office of Health Equity has helped with what's called an equity playbook. There, you may recall that there's an equity metric that counties have to address, so that the lowest performing census tracts on an indicator in their counties have to have a similar test positivity rate to the rest of the county. And so we put together about an 80-page playbook in our department and in collaboration with others to help counties address equity in those communities. And I bring that up because obviously these populations that are most affected by the pandemic, most heavily affected, are overlap considerably with populations and communities that are affected by climate change, both now and in the future. So whether it's heat-related illness or wildfire smoke or things like that. So it's important overlap, and we're really looking at the pandemic of COVID as also coinciding with the climate change impacts and racial equity and economic inequality. So there's kind of three pandemics in a way going on concurrently, and it's really important for us that we're addressing these and addressing those most vulnerable that are, as we say, hurt first and worst by things like this. So we're continuing to work on that, and we're hoping to really use this as an opportunity. The pandemic, as terrible as it is, there are things that we can all come out of this and make the future even better than it was before the pandemic. Along that line, I'll put in the chat for Juliet. She can, I think she can share that with everybody. I hope that we have a web page that we've developed that looks at COVID-19, climate change, and health equity kind of concurrently, and has a lot of resources there for that. So if people are interested in that. I intended to put that in there. Let's see if that works. Yeah, I'll do that in a moment. All right, then just to mention, we've actually prioritized climate change in our department. We have a standalone climate change unit now. I don't think that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, but basically it's been approved. So, and that unit is about twice as big as it was before. It's a small team, was 5 and now is 10, and Linda Helland is leading that unit. Our local health officers association, of which Wilma Wooten, who's a member of the TAC, Dr. Wooten, is part of. Just so you all know, climate change continues to be in their top 3 strategic priorities at the local level as well. So we interact a lot with them to help them address that. Lastly, I'll just mention that we interact a lot with Cali PA. And you just heard from Heather about some of their activities. Cal Virus Screen, for example, we are working with them on a project to look at several indices of economic disadvantage and community impacts of various things. And one of them is the Healthy Places Index and many others. So we have a monthly coordination meeting with Cali PA, and climate aspects are often part of that. For example, the wildfires that I think Tina was getting to when she was cut off by the internet. You know, wildfire impacts overlapping with the pandemic as well. So whether it's smoke or debris cleanup, you know, we coordinate with Air Resources Board and others at Cali PA. So with that, I think that I will stop. I'm probably over my time. Well, actually, one other last thing I want to mention, there's a climate action team, and I think some of the comments that Amanda mentioned about the governor's executive orders have been taken up by the climate action team across state entities. And there's also a public health work group that's a subgroup of that climate action team. And so our department hosts that work group. And we do, the last couple of meetings have been in collaboration with the Air Resources Board and looking at climate change and air quality programs, the tools and methods to expand assessments of the benefits of such programs. And also just recently in November, we had guidance, research, and tools for regarding communities and the health impacts of wildfire smoke. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mark. Really appreciate you taking the time. I know you all have, put in so much work and effort over this year. So appreciate everything you all are doing. Now I will go to Tina in the hopes that we can hear her a little bit better.
Well, thanks for the pro tips. I turned off my video, so I'm going to look and see if you can hear me at least this time. Yes, now?
I think so,
Okay.
yes, so far, but I will let
Okay.
you know if it isn't.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. And just really quick, because I think you heard some of it, even if it was garbled. But as Mark said, historic fire season. I think the important thing for this group is, we have many counties under federal disaster declaration. I think 27. It might have increased since then, which is really massive for a fire. But with that, the silver lining comes opportunities to invest in wildfire resilience, because we do have those programs turned on from FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, for hazard mitigation. So the ability to redirect those into investments towards more wildfire resilience is an opportunity that we do have, fortunately, with with those events. I want to introduce Lori Nizura. She's on the Zoom. You may have met her before. She's not new to Cal OES, but she has taken over the position that I had as Deputy Director of Preparedness when I first joined. And she's also going to be handling our climate. Lori to join us. She'll be my backup for this committee and integrating with all of you in her new role. So very glad to have her on board. And, and just thank to this group. We did publish an adaptation guide over the summer. I know this really helped make that possible, but I think now going forward, we're interested in the uptake for it. We are funding a lot of local hazard mitigation plans because of the investment opportunities that we have. So that's one way that Cal OES is going to be evaluate the use of the APG, but certainly your ideas on and comments on how that's going out there and how people are actually using it is going to be the really valuable part of that document. So I think I'll close on that note, and just happy to discuss. Thanks for the chance to update. Hopefully that went better.
Yes, thank you, Tina. There was a little bit of a breakup towards the end, but I think we got it in terms of our partnership on OES's leading up the update to the adaptation planning guide and in that integration into the adaptation clearinghouse, and just OES's important role in helping to bridge that work into updates to local hazard mitigation plans. So I think that was the end of what you were saying, but everything else came through clearly. So thank you. Well, thank you to all the state partners for the updates. I will give a couple quick updates from OPR and from our work here, and then we'll be able to have some discussion among the council, any questions for our state partners, and then public comment. But before we go to that, I just want to just start off with our excitement in building back up our team at OPR. I think many of you know, as with everybody else across the state and the country, this year has been quite disruptive to everything. And we are very excited. We've been able to kind of build back up our team with some staff transitions and trying to figure out some creative regrouping given the budget implications that COVID has had to the state budget. So with that, I think we've introduced Juliet Hart, who joined the team I think the day before our last council meeting. So just really excited to have Juliet on the team. Thank you for all your work to organize this meeting while you're still getting looped in as part of the team. I'm not going to go over all of the things that we're doing because we'll have a programmatic update, and new team members will also be able to share some of the work that they're leading up. But I do want to acknowledge that Sarah Samden is also on the line, and she has recently joined the team. So excited to hear from her too. And then just a big thank you to Nikki for all of her work on the APG and everything she does to support our work. So a quick note, just building on Amanda's update around the state adaptation strategy, and just reinforcing that, we're very excited to be working so closely with Natural Resources Agency to scope out the update to the state adaptation strategy, and really excited for the opportunity now kind of on the front end of this update that, in previous years, we did not have ICARP up and running as a program and kind of serving as this hub for interagency coordination across state and local efforts. So really looking to leverage our program as well as, our council. So all of, the tremendous wealth and insight that you all will provide. So that will definitely be, a key component of our work moving forward, and just really want to thank Resources for the great partnership and excited for this update moving forward. And just to kind of connect the dots here, later in the afternoon, after we take our lunch break, Juliet is going to give an update on the resilience metric work and just the exciting opportunity for that work that we're going to be doing through ICARP and through the TAC work group to really inform and drive progress as we think about this state update to the state adaptation strategy to really much better understand how to track our progress over time. So thank you in advance to everybody for your engagement in that effort, and just want to make sure that there's a clear connection from our point on that work feeding into the next update to the state adaptation strategy. Another priority for us in the program just generally is really working to build back up our internal state agency coordination work, and really recognizing the importance of that, the important point that, we really need the state and state agencies to be well coordinated around adaptation and resilience, recognizing it touches every aspect of life in California. And so really working to stand that up and do more interagency coordination there now that we have our team back up and running again. So I'm very excited about that. Two quick things I'll just mention. One is a quick reminder for those who were in the conversations last year and at the beginning of this calendar year, as we were mapping out our priorities as a council, we had really identified and talked about the need to better understand how to address vulnerability to impacts of climate change, and to better understand communities and populations that are at most risk and most vulnerable to climate impacts. This has evolved and grown from the council's leadership and work to define vulnerable communities that we did in the first couple years of the program. And if you all remember, we actually had some funding proposed in last year's budget, the governor's January climate budget, to support really driving this work forward. As with everything, the budget process, state budget impacts from COVID have kind of put some of that on pause in terms of moving forward for this budget year, but we have been working hard over the summer to kind of regroup and find a path forward to do this important work. So we're still working through some of the administrative and kind of organizational pieces on this, but I am very excited that we are going to be able to, in the coming year, really kick off a partnership effort to develop a vulnerable communities platform. I want to thank we're still working through the administrative pieces, as I mentioned, but I think I can do a formal thank you to the Hilton Foundation, who has stepped in to provide some funding and a grant to OPR to support the staff capacity to do this work. I also want to thank and acknowledge Ami, who's on the line. I'm sorry, not Ami, but Sona, who's on the line, and then Ami from APEN. We have been working in close partnership with both Greenlining and APEN to make sure that this effort will be grounded in community perspective and experience, to make sure that this platform is really reflecting communities on the ground. And so we'll bring more detail on this in our future meetings, but really excited to be gearing up to do this work. We have a lot of interagency partnerships also to make sure that this works and meets needs, and we'll definitely be engaging the council to make sure that what we're building is also meeting the needs of our local government partners and other community partners who are really trying to work to identify and understand community vulnerability. So quick update there. The other piece that I want to highlight is some of the work that we've done on the climate finance and driving on the governor's climate finance agenda. I don't know if everybody saw, but in September, there were two announcements that came out during Climate Week. One was that, as Darwin mentioned, the California signed on to the Coalition of Climate Resilient Investment. So we're going to be engaging in that international public-private initiative that is a United Nations Climate Action Summit and COP26 flagship initiative. And really the objective is to foster a much more efficient integration of climate risk into investment decision-making. So we're excited to be a part of that effort. The other is the governor called for standing up a climate risk disclosure advisory group, really to think about how do we, as California, think about the disclosure of climate risk in our investment decisions. So we're working definitely to build on the momentum around the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD, for those who know about it. But that work, as well as our engagement with CCRI, will be kicking off in the new year too. So a lot moving on the climate finance side as well. Lastly, I just want to acknowledge that we have, as we look to the next year, we have definitely heard the council and many other of our partners' calls to really think about how we use our council meetings to do more place-based conversations and direct engagement within regions around different issues and topics, or issues that people are trying to work on in the adaptation and resilience space. So we haven't quite had the capacity to pull that off this year in the virtual space, but I just want to let everyone know that is top of mind. And as we go through our the rest of our agenda here, we definitely see for today lots of opportunity for that type of direct engagement, even in a virtual world. Really trying to foster those conversations that we had been able to facilitate in previous years when we traveled around the state and actually met with people in their place. So looking to build that back in, and just wanted to acknowledge that we have heard the calls for that and are working to build that in. So with that, I will stop now. I'm sure I went over our time limit, and now we can turn it over to discussion and any questions from the council members. So again, if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll open it up. Okay, it looks like Janna. Yeah, I see your hand.
Thank you. So again, I'm Janna Gannon. I'm the Sustainability and Government Affairs Director for the Blue Lake Rancheria Tribal Government. And it's an honor to continue to sit on this, this committee and council. I have two comments. One is for probably for Darwin, but could impact others as well. You know, we sure see the need for greater resilience and GHG reductions to have transportation projects include extra conduits and other infrastructure for other utilities like broadband fiber and or undergrounding power lines. So in our region, we really need that alignment of infrastructure needs and projects in the same rights of way to reduce costs and speed implementation as much as possible. This is in alignment with Governor Newsom's Executive Order N7320 under the deployment section number 7, where it requires transportation projects to identify and incorporate installation of conduit and or fiber into all appropriate and feasible projects alongside strategic corridors. So I just want to point that out as, like, you know, when we're talking about climate smart adaptation, that really is something that we're seeing a pretty significant need for. And then to Heather, about the Cal Virus Screen update, I'm wondering what work is being done within that effort to incorporate criteria that have potentially greater application to tribal lands and to rural areas, particularly in Northern California and other places. For tribal and rural applicability, these considerations I think are important, and I'll put these notes in the chat and send it to the coordinators so that maybe they can provide them to you in writing. But you know, the current Cal Virus Screen includes things like cardiovascular disease, but not diabetes. It includes pesticides, but not herbicides. It includes solid waste site facilities, but not illegal dumps. and it includes poverty, but not specifics around like LIHEAP or government food subsidy recipients. There's a long list. I won't go into it here, but I'm really glad you're doing the work to update Cal Enviro Screen. I think it's necessary to broaden and refine its scope a little bit. So thank you so much for all your hard work on that.
Great. Maybe Darwin, we'll go to you and then Heather for a response.
Sure, happy to start off. Thank you so much for highlighting in particular the broadband need. It's very much kind of front of mind as we're doing our work. You know, I will say, just given the scope of our executive order, given the other executive order that you also mentioned, a lot of what our action plan will be doing is pointing to other efforts happening on this, but rest assured that it is front of mind in the transportation realm, and yeah, we're working hard on implementation of the broadband deal.
Great, thank you, Darwin. Heather.
Yes, thank you so much for those points. And I would love to, if you could share the, the specifics that you pointed out here in the longer list, and I'd be happy to share that with my colleagues who are working on the updates. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Great, thank you. And so next on the list, we've got Heather Rock and then Jonathan Parfrey.
Hi, I just wanted to flag how pleased I am to hear that OPR is working with Green Lining and APEN on the disadvantaged communities platform. I just want to emphasize the importance of having agreed upon, I guess, metrics for how we access this information and what defines the disadvantaged communities, which I know, ICARP has worked on before. And I flag this because, as some of you might be aware, the California Public Utilities Commission in August has directed all of California's IOUs to conduct climate vulnerability assessments and to engage with every disadvantaged and vulnerable community in the service territory before, during, and after. And the definition of these disadvantaged vulnerable communities, of course, became a topic of discussion, and the commission issued its own definition of these communities, and the IOUs are required to now post information on our respective websites about where these disadvantaged communities are located. And it would just be great to be able to sync that map with the map that OPR has, so that other people who might be looking at this know that we're all measuring the same thing and engaging with the same communities to avoid confusion. That's it.
Great, thank you so much, Heather. Yes, and that work that the PUC has been leading and working on through the rulemaking has definitely informed the conversations and the thinking, and also highlighted the need for this work. One just quick clarification, it's a vulnerable communities platform. To your point around the importance of definitions, we definitely want to ensure that, for example, EPA's leadership work and OEHA through developing Cal Enviro Screen has a tool for identifying disadvantaged communities that informs allocation and investments through cap and trade. But as you mentioned, Heather, there are many, many definitions out there in addition to that. And so really our goal is to bring together a platform that allows users to be able to understand the factors that are driving vulnerability and overlay with these other existing definitions and tools that are there. So just wanted to add that quick note in and appreciate your comment. So now I will go to Jonathan Parfrey.
Thank you, Tara. I have a question for Mark Starr. I really appreciated your presentation. And my question, Mark, is, has CDPH created an action plan or a strategic plan related to the climate work? Great news that your staff has doubled in size, but kind of wondering what everyone's working on. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a lot of information. I think I could have our staff share some of the various action plans and things that we are working on. Some of the things I mentioned, I have a long list here that I didn't have time to go through, but Some of the new staff, for example, are working on with the Community Services and Development Department on implementing AB 1232, which is low income weatherization program. So that because of that legislation, we added staff to help work on that with Community Services and Development. We coordinate with the Air Resources Board on some tool that's just been published on the web called Healthy Mobility Options tool, but it was based on the Integrated Transport and Health Impact Model tool. And I didn't mention tribal work, but that's come up. So part of what we're doing both with the pandemic and with climate change is with tribal entities. And then we work a lot across our department because it is a small team, and our department has many programs that touch on climate change in many aspects, everything from vector-borne disease to environmental exposures. And we talked about wildfire response. We'll be involved in public health impacts of a drought if there's another drought. So we support across our department climate change coordination and planning. And we also work with the local health jurisdictions, try and guide them to some of these things that they can do at a local level to improve adaptation, resiliency, including funding sources from different entities. And this kind of goes to the prior question of, how are communities identified for cap and trade funding, and whether which indexes are used to identify vulnerable or disadvantaged communities. So that's just a kind of a smattering, but I could have our staff put something more structured together if that would be helpful.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much for the great work. The reason I was asking is because I was very impressed by your presentation, and it's so important to have the public health departments engaged on climate, and it's great to see they're stepping up. Thanks.
Thank you. And I got to give credit to our team who helped put a lot of this together for me. And Linda Helen, I think, is on the call actually today, and she really is leading the charge for this.
And thanks to Helen, Linda Helen.
Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Great, thank you. And Mark, maybe as we look into next year, if there's opportunities for the team to maybe give updates on that work plan and the work that you're doing, we can always leverage these meetings as an opportunity. Next, I think we've got Jason and then David Loya.
Thanks, Tara. From Southern California's perspective, we're really happy to hear about the focus on the implementation that Natural Resources Agency has and CalSTA on the implementation side of the executive orders. We just adopted our regional transportation plan, which has multi-billion-dollar investments in transportation infrastructure in the region. And the whole point of our sustainable community strategy is to balance land use decision-making, conservation opportunities, and transportation investments. So I just had a quick question for Darwin. As the state moves forward with a climate action plan for transportation investments, how would the regional agencies and some self-help counties be engaged in that process and evaluating their transportation investments?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. It's a good question. So we, in terms of the process to come up with the actions, we've had a process underway. We had a survey last summer, a workshop, much of which was aimed at, in addition to our other stakeholders, the transportation agencies who deliver these projects were kind of the key set of stakeholders, and that'll continue when the draft is out with a follow-up workshop there. But in terms of, it sounds like your question may be more about the implementation thereafter. Once we have a plan and we're working on implementing that plan, the plan will call out key areas where we'll need additional working groups and coordination with regional and local agencies in particular. I mean, some of this is more on the GHG reduction side, but to give you an example, equitable pricing solutions and finding pathways for transportation, roadway pricing, removing various legislative barriers and creating pathways for the RTPSESs to be able to implement the strategies that they've named in there. is an area that we're identifying as a need for strong state and regional collaboration through potential new task forces or working groups. So there'll be things like that identified in the plan where we can kind of partner with you all to move implementation forward.
Great, thank you.
David.
Thank you, Tara. And thank you to all of the state agencies for presenting. It was really great to hear the updates. I specifically wanted to ask you, Amanda, about the conservation work, which is really exciting because I think there's a great nexus between land use conservation or land conservation and infill land use policies, and then climate adaptation, real clear linkage in my mind. And one of the things that we struggle with locally here is generating the capacity to purchase easements and or lands to add to that conservation. I'm just curious if there are any implementation ideas or funds that may be coming down through this work that Resource Agency is doing. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, and apologies in advance because I've got a lot of like chainsaws going on in the background here. Our trees are getting trimmed, healthy trees. I can answer partially, unfortunately. I mean, these, as I understand it, because this actually isn't my super area of expertise, conservation easements are a super critical tool, and that there are many different kinds, and that there are challenges sort of associated with various kinds on various landscapes. So I do think, my colleague, Jennifer Norris, she's a scientist on our team. She's Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat. And she's really the big brains behind developing our 30 by 30s pathway. The big brain who's going to be bringing in a lot of other big brains. But I know for a fact that this is an issue that is going to be explored through the conversation with stakeholders over the course of next year. The conversations that we've had have kind of been her explaining to me some of these, different tools with different roles and maybe how to sort of identify what makes the most sense. But I think, if there are specific flags or issues that you wanted to raise in the immediate term, I would point to paragraph 5 of this executive order, which there's a lot of things that we're calling for in this executive order that have a process associated with it. And we were like, we've just got to have at least something in here that's like, and we're going to start now. So the language in paragraph 5 is really, I refer to it as sort of the action agenda paragraph. And we're basically within that paragraph saying, look, we're already doing actually quite a bit of work in this space, but where could we do more with existing funds? And so, as an example, there's 5 pillars of this action agenda that we've outlined: forests, wetlands, agricultural soils, urban greening, urban green spaces, and then land conservation. And I would point to, there's a couple of folks that between the Resources Agency and OPR that are sort of leading the charge on this effort to identify where are there opportunities for us to do more with what we've got. And so I would encourage, maybe Nu and Tara, I don't know, maybe we can follow up afterwards with the names and email addresses of all the people who are sort of leading the charge on those pillars, so that you can contact them to find out, how you can engage, but also just sharing your ideas. As someone who is leading on the forest and the urban green spaces pillar, I would love those ideas. So those are my thoughts. And I think budget, I'm not going to comment on at this point, but I think everybody understands why.
Yeah, Amanda, to your point, we can absolutely share that out, and both to the group, and then it can be in the minutes too. We'll add that to the minutes for the meeting. I think another piece, just to mention it very quickly, is another opportunity for us to learn from is the work that's happening through the Sustainable Agricultural Lands Conservation Program, or SALC, that is through SGC in partnership with the Department of Conservation. And so they're definitely involved and helping to bring that into the conversation. presentation. And just a note that at the upcoming SGC Council meeting next week, there will be a presentation from around SALC, as well as proposed award recommendations for that program. So in case anybody's interested, just flagging that. I think next, Janna. Oh, and then Gloria. I see that too.
Sorry, I just have a quick comment relative to the definition of vulnerable communities or disadvantaged communities. The SB 350 Disadvantaged Communities Advisory Group created a document that included their adopted definition of disadvantaged communities. I've put it in the chat box, and we'll make it available in the minutes in case it's helpful. And of course, that definition is advocated by the Disadvantaged Communities Advisory Group to be used by both the California Public Utilities Commission and the California Energy Commission in their programs and policies. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Janna. Gloria.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for all the presentations. I think everything was rich, and I'm always excited to hear and see our commitment to, in particular, serving vulnerable, what we call vulnerable communities and or disadvantaged communities or frontline communities. And so the thing that's coming up for me that often comes up in a lot of spaces that I just want to offer to us, you know, thinking about our advantage of having interagency engagement and access and you know, trying to do this from kind of local to state level, wanting to encourage us in this body, you know, appreciating, of course, SONA from Greenlining and AMI from APEN, trusting them and their expertise and leadership, and wanting to invite us to engage with other community organizations across the state that are representing Black, Indigenous, immigrant, and people of color rich communities across the state. And pushing ourselves to really have that representation. I think that as we've talked about, a lot of spaces you know, are engaging around how we define disadvantaged, vulnerable, frontline communities, which is great. And I want to ask us to also push ourselves around how we define equity, because that's another piece that I just feel like everyone's throwing around now, but not like investments aren't really matching with it and strategies aren't matching with it. And so when we're thinking about equity, it really is having targeted strategies or over-investing where we've historically disinvested and underinvested. And so really defining for this body so that we can set a precedence across the state and localities around equity metrics and standards, you know, things we're going to hold ourselves accountable to. And yeah, and really stating things like, okay, these are areas that have been historically disinvested and underinvested, and so overinvestment in these areas will look like this. Because that's really what equity is about, is leveling the playing field. And so that's just an offering I want to share with us that's just coming up for me in a lot of different spaces where I feel like we kind of use these great terms, but our practices, strategies, and more importantly, our investments aren't necessarily matching with what these terms like equity in particular mean.
Gloria, can I just say, I really appreciate your comments, and I, you know, as we've been thinking about implementing this nature-based solutions executive order, we've had some really useful conversations with folks who have asked sort of what's happening and, you know, how can I help, or when is it, when are we going to get started, et cetera. And, you know, very thoughtful people advise that this be something that we address early, like up front, so that we don't get to the end of the process and we're all completely thinking about this in a different way. And so I just want to express support for the suggestion. And, you know, all of us just outlined like all these different processes that we have going, and this is sort of like the the greatest and the worst thing. Is like everybody's doing a lot of work, but are we sometimes in our silos too much? Absolutely. So as we are making this really concerted effort to get out of that, I think the point of, within each of these plans or efforts, how are you thinking about this, and how are you building it in early so we don't end up with problems on the back end, is a really useful flag. So thank you. And I will just say that, as we think about the executive order implementation, that point was made clearly, and we agree that it is important. So I think, sorry. We'll just put the flag out there to this group that, to the extent that you have thoughts on what does it mean to achieve 30 by 30 in an equitable way? What does it mean to use our landscapes to protect people from the impacts of climate change in an equitable way? Very welcome. Sorry.
Thank you, Amanda. I see Sona, you have your hand raised.
Can I comment on that one? Are we leaving that question?
No, well, I was going to come back and also respond, but I have a sense maybe that Sona also had a direct response. So maybe I'll let Sona go, and then Mark, I'll come back to you.
Perfect, thanks.
Thanks, everyone. And yeah, thanks so much, Gloria, for your question and comment. And I just wanted to, I don't think we've discussed this yet here, but I just wanted to offer that, yeah, APED and Greenlining have been working really closely to help OPR and other agencies really envision what does this mapping tool look like that works to identify communities hit hardest by climate impacts. And I do want to offer that one of the most kind of transformative and exciting parts of this idea, this proposal, is that we're working to put together a community advisory committee that would really help drive the vision for what this tool looks like, make sure that there's diverse representation, particularly from like Black and Indigenous communities across the state of California, really recognizing that while data can provide us with a lot of information, it doesn't always tell us the whole story. And we need to be supplementing that data with the lived experiences of communities that are hit hardest. And so I think that's for us is one of the most integral parts of this idea, is to make sure that as we develop a mapping platform that aims to identify communities that are hit hardest, that those communities are providing input to the mapping tool itself.
Great, thank you, Sona. And I will just add very quickly, Mark, just because there's a direct connection, and then I'll hand it to you, Gloria, to your point around, what are the metrics and standards and definitions. And I absolutely agree. I think, we're really trying to think about how are we as the state across all these efforts moving in a concerted way that is clear, that's transparent, and that is, as Sona mentioned, kind of reflective of what lived experience on the ground as well. So I think one opportunity, in addition to this platform, development of this platform and the exciting partnership with this community advisory committee, another opportunity for us to have this conversation is as we think about the state's adaptation strategy. And so I just wanted to connect that dot, that I think is going to be an important place where we can have this conversation and the council, and kind of bringing broader engagement through our networks and with our communities into the conversation there. And then another piece just on the metrics point too, I think that's a really important priority for us as this council and the work group around resilience metrics, really making sure that we're bringing that into the conversation as well. So just flagging a couple other opportunities where I see us having the space to really drive on what you mentioned, Gloria. So.
Thank you so much. And Mark, I know you want to share something too. And thank you, Sona. And I just really want to underscore the equity piece, because I think we've all defined, we're all clear what disadvantage and frontline and all of this is, but it's equity. And I think it's great, absolutely, have a structural way for our communities to shape it. And really glad, Sona, that you shared with us kind of expanding folks who will be at the table helping to shape the tool. And I'm in particular just wanting to emphasize like the equity piece of us defining what that means. And, as I shared, I'm often thinking about investments and the strategies that we're employing. And again, if equity is really about leveling the playing field, then that's kind of the center that I think is really important to hold with when we're having conversations around equity. And it's definitely starting first in these places, but it's also really over investing and really emphasizing these places and spaces in ways that we have not done historically. And so appreciating, all the thoughtfulness again around the disadvantaged and vulnerable communities and frontline communities, but just really wanting to push us further on equity and our strategies for equitable investments and equitable strategies. Because again, it's just one of those words that I think is just being thrown around, but people's practices, strategies, and investments are not really matching with it. And I want to figure out how we can set a precedence that will help hopefully translate to other state agencies, and localities. That's really saying that we have to have target overemphasis in areas that have been historically just, ignored and disinvested. And sorry, Mark, because I know you wanted to share something too.
Yes, please, Mark.
I'm happy to listen to you, Gloria, and really appreciate your comments. And I think, we often just say that equality and equity are two different things. And so we're talking about going beyond equality and overinvesting, as you're talking about, in order to bring us to a point where there is equity in various communities. And so it's part of the reason our climate change program in public health is in our Office of Health Equity, is because of the need to emphasize those aspects of climate change impacts. I wanted to mention two things. One on the indicators and indexes that are used. I kind of breezed through that myself, but as I mentioned, we coordinate with CaliPA, and we have formed a group to work on some of the various ways of looking at disadvantaged communities, where they are, what indexes are the best to use. Calendar screen we've talked about a lot. I think I mentioned Healthy Places Index, and there's others. And kind of segueing over to our pandemic response, I really breezed through this equity playbook and equity metric that our state has implemented in response to the pandemic. But the metric itself is based on the Healthy Places Index communities that are in the lowest quartile in a given county. And the counties have funding that's dedicated towards equity in the pandemic, and they are charged with addressing those communities and bringing that metric down to be comparable or hopefully better than the rest of the county. So this playbook will be public, we hope, in the next day or so. We'll actually post it on our COVID web pages on many places. And it has a number of measures that are more short-term to get more people tested, to be able to support social supports for people that are quarantine or isolation and things like that. But the reason I brought it up today, actually, in my earlier comments, is because there's also middle and long-term strategies in there. And it's full of examples of things that have worked elsewhere, as well as kind of menu of ideas that local jurisdictions can try to implement. And so the longer term things would be addressing things like housing and multi-generational housing, or crowding, or access to housing, transportation, community engagement and communication, and cultural and linguistic approaches, and all those things that we're all familiar with in the world of equity. But this is really an opportunity to, it's been overused lately, but to bounce forward and use the pandemic as a way to address longer standing inequities that cause other health disparities. And when the pandemic's all over, we're hopefully have communities in a better situation. So thanks very much for your comments. They resonate well with us in public health.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. Are there any other comments or questions from the council? All right, it looks like that is it. I really appreciate everybody's thoughtful input and questions to the state updates. we will definitely, continue to have this in as a standing item on our agendas moving forward, and this opportunity for dialogue and for us to be able to share what all is going on at the state level. But also just a note that, many of the comments and much of what we heard today will also be taken into our thinking as we move to develop and prepare for the next meeting, where we're going to be talking about our 2021 priorities. So really appreciate all this conversation and input. Before we move to the next agenda item, I just want to see if there are any comments or questions from the public who are on the line. If you do have any questions, please raise your hand. I'm going to give people a minute here just to find the raise hand option if they want. All right, I'm not seeing anything come up. So we will move on now to agenda item 4, which is ICARP updates. And this will be a quicker item here. Just wanted to keep everyone apprised of the programmatic work we're doing here at ICARP, and then we'll move on to the Wildfire Technical Advice Series. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Juliet to kick us off.
Hi there. So hopefully you're seeing the slide and not the notes, or do I need to switch?
Nope, perfect view.
Great. Okay, thank you. I'm excited to have this opportunity to be a part of the team now. So we're going to go quickly with our ICARP updates. And so the team members here are each going to go forth. So Nikki is first up.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Awesome. Okay. Nice to see you all again. Since last we've met, we've had some exciting developments, most notably the launch of the updated Adaptation Clearinghouse. And now we're shifting to general resource improvements in the database and leveraging the APG that's on there now to help communities in practice. And so just as a recap, at the last TAC meeting, we dove deep into user analytics and feedback and site updates from the APG integration process, or adaptation planning guide, excuse me. And we heard from TAC members about the need for technical assistance for communities using the adaptation planning guide, as well as a desire for more interactive and multimedia content. So now, based on that feedback, I'm excited to share with you 2 new developments with the Clearinghouse. The first being a series of how-to videos and use case videos that we can use as promotional and educational content to live on the site and promote the Adaptation Clearinghouse, as well as a series of deeper dive workshops featuring the Adaptation Planning Guide starting in 2021, which would feature technical experts and resources and the opportunity for communities to workshop local adaptation efforts. So I'd love to invite TAC members to support us and participate and provide feedback on both of those efforts. So just a little bit more about the videos. I'm trying to speed through this here, but the first series is going to be more of a tutorial series and how to use the site, sort of touring people through this search feature and different features of the general site overall. And then the second series would be use case or user scenario series, based on the idea that TAC members raised last October on specific scenarios that different users encounter on the site. And so we're still fleshing out the process for the use case videos, but hopefully momentarily before the end of December, we'll have some cool promotional content to share with you all. Next slide, please. And we're currently scoping the first of this series of workshops. The first one would feature case studies from communities that worked on the draft adaptation planning guide. And then our concept for the subsequent webinars is to base each one on a phase of the planning process paired with more technical aspects that we've heard a lot of communities are struggling with in the adaptation process. So community engagement, choosing tools and data, adaptation strategies and pathways, and funding and financing alongside the different 4 phases. And I'd again love to invite TAC feedback on any topics or resources, case studies, speakers, et cetera, that you think that we should be really honing in on as content for those workshops, and any thoughts you have on the structure for those to make sure that we're leveraging these workshops and our time well for the communities so that they can use it effectively. And then finally, next slide, please. Just want to blow through some analytics for you. the long and the short of my long analytics report, which I'm not going to go through today for time, is that the outreach events that we did in September and the launch of the new site have really drawn a lot of new users to the site, and we can totally see a spike in usership, and people are coming back more. They're using the site as intended, basically. The adaptation planning guide is by far and away the most visited part of the site since its launch in early November. That's all I'll say on that. I can dive into the numbers if anyone's curious later. And then the last slide here, just a quick update on other priorities for site updates in 2021. We're still scoping out the process, but based on continued analytics and how people are using different topic pages, we want to hone in on some of the most popular topics. So plan alignment, equity and environmental justice, investing in adaptation, and then finally, resources for tribal and Native American communities on the site. So we're going to be working on beefing up the pages that are already on the site, adding more resources, and really honing in on those areas to make sure that they're working well. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. I think we'll go through these and then take questions at the end of all these updates, if that works. So next up is Sarah Samden, who will talk about some work with FEMA.
Great, thanks, Juliet. Can everyone hear me?
You're good, yep.
Okay. Good morning, council members. My name is Sarah Samden, and I recently joined the OPR ICARP team as an assistant planner. For the next few minutes, I'll be talking briefly about an update about our OPR FEMA Cooperative Technical Partners Grant. So OPR through ICARP was invited to apply to FEMA's CTP grant program, which aims to strengthen and enhance the effectiveness of the National Flood Insurance Program. We were fortunate enough to be awarded a CTP Community Outreach and Mitigation Strategies Award. Through this partnership, OPR will provide technical assistance and coordination support to align federal hazard mitigation assistance funding with state programmatic resiliency goals. And through this 18-month grant period, we were able to cover my staff time, where I'll be overseeing the day-to-day implementation of our CTP grant program, as well as part-time for Beth Hotchkiss, who I believe is on the line, who is an OPR staff member who will be leading up our feasibility study efforts that will begin in January. And just a brief overview of our CTP team, we have members from Region 9 FEMA at the Hazard Mitigation Unit, and then also members from Cal OES and their Hazard Mitigation Unit that will be providing state-level expertise on hazard mitigation. Next slide, please. And so in our grant agreement, there are two overall goals and deliverables that we're hoping to accomplish within the 18-month period. The first one is the coordination and development of at least 2 flood risk mitigation pilot projects that can meet FEMA hazard mitigation assistance eligibility requirements. And these projects will serve as proof of concept of how to better align state funding programs with FEMA's HMA funding. And then the second goal is the 6-month feasibility study that I mentioned earlier that Beth will be carrying out that will outline the technical, financial, and partnership requirements necessary to support a public-facing, easily navigable local government risk mitigation project database that will be housed in the Adaptation Clearinghouse. And again, these efforts will begin in January 2021. Next slide, please. And so through this 18-month grant partnership, we will be focusing on hard-to-reach priority projects that have been identified by FEMA and will advance flood mitigation pilot projects that strengthen FEMA's portfolio of nature-based, social, and environmental justice-based projects. And as you can see on the slide, the 3 main project types that FEMA has identified us to focus on with this grant is soil health, urban greening, and seismic safety for multifamily residents. And the one caveat with this is that our funding is coming from the National Flood Institute program, so all of these projects must have a flood nexus. Next slide, please. And then this slide just talks briefly about the state partners that we've been in conversation with about joining our CTP grant. As you can see, we have members from the Food and Ag, Natural Resources Agency, and the California Earthquake Authority, as well as the other CTP grant members. So the Nature Conservancy in California, they have their own CTP grant, but they have capacity to support us a little bit on identifying some benefit cost analysis to meet FEMA HMA requirements. And in early January, we'll be having our interagency kickoff meeting where we'll be working with our CTP members as well as our state partners to help identify a preliminary list of project types that are eligible for HMA funding. And we'll be working with that through March 2021 and then following March 2021 to the end of our grant period, we'll be walking these project types through HMA eligibility. We know that this is of great interest to many of you, and we will definitely keep you all in the loop and come back with updates about our CTP grant. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. And hold on. There we go. And I'll bring the last slide up, which is about some grants that we have through the Prop 84 money. So Prop 84 was a while ago, but through those grants, there was some money that was able to be brought back in. And so we were able to repackage that money and put it out to look at fire affected communities. So this is in partnership with the Strategic Growth Council and the Department of Conservation, and OPR will be managing these grants moving out and then handing it off through the interagency shuffle. But there are 4 communities that have been funded by it. The city of Moore Park is looking to update their climate change vulnerability assessment and general plan. Sonoma County is looking to update their, just get the notes. The funding will support the county's forest resource management efforts through development of a comprehensive management ordinance for both forested landscape and urban forests. The county will be using the funding to move from a piecemeal policy landscape around forest management to implement an integrated approach. The town of Paradise, with over 13,000 residences lost in 2018 due to the Camp Fire, the town's housing landscape dramatically changed overnight, making their existing plans no longer relevant. So this funding will support their housing element update with a focus on fire safe and affordable infill development. And finally, but not last, is Ventura County, which will be working to develop their general plan update and working in conjunction with their local coastal program update. And so following the Thomas Fire, they will be looking at how a key existing environmental justice issues and inequity were amplified by the wildfire, including multilingual access to emergency information, evacuation bottlenecks, and impacts to domestic service and outdoor workers. So all of these, they're small but mighty grants that all tackle different really important components of what to do after a fire. And what we're really hoping is that we'll be able to share the lessons learned from all of these and use this to move forward and help other fire affected communities. And so all of these will have case studies in the Adaptation Clearinghouse, and we hope to bring these to the council once they get going. They're just now doing their agreements. So that is just a quick update on those. And I think we have time for comments before we move to our next item.
Great, thank you, Juliet, Sarah, and Nikki for those updates. And as you can tell, we are really trying to, through our work through ICARP, through these programmatic efforts, really trying to drive on providing resources to our local community partners across a number of different areas, and really trying to think about how we can be providing more direct technical assistance and support as we're all trying to better integrate adaptation and resilience into our work. So thank you all for all your work. Any questions or comments from council members on any of these?
I just really quickly want to echo Juliet's comment about them being small but mighty grants, that ILG was proud to be part of both the town of Paradise and the city of Ventura's grants. And I will tell you that both would not be able to do these planning efforts had it not be for the grants. Ventura is doing a large general plan update, but they would not have done a climate action plan. And probably now with COVID would probably kick it down the road for at least another 5 years. So thank you guys so much for these grants.
Great, thank you so much, Carolee. I did just get a note from Michelle in. She is not able to unmute at the moment, but she does have a question for us. So the question is on the Cooperative Technical Partners Grant. Will the flood risk mitigation projects include assessment of co-benefits like carbon sequestration? That is a great question. And actually it is something that we are going to be exploring through this process. We, on the OPR side, are new to the hazard mitigation assistance funding, kind of the details, the programmatic details there. And so really very thankful to have OES as a key partner on this effort. So I can't necessarily answer the specific kind of technicalities of how, or how that would be integrated in now, but it's something is definitely on the list. I think one of the things we are very interested in through this partnership grant is how we can better align federal and state dollars to drive on our climate goals. And while, as Sarah said, there has to be a flood nexus to this, to the projects that we move forward through this process, we are absolutely, and have already talked with all the partners on the grant around how we can think about the other benefits to these pilot projects that are moving through this process. And given the priority areas that FEMA has identified in terms of soil health and in terms of some of the urban greening, we have talked about the importance of these projects being able to drive on our climate mitigation goals. So long answer to say, yes, definitely a priority for us to explore that and how we can make sure that that is part of the part of this effort, but it is definitely something we need to kind of understand what are the pathways to be able to do that to align this federal funding. So quick response there. Michelle, let me know if you have other questions. Okay, she said thanks. So any other questions, comments from council members? All right, not seeing any. I'm just going to double check with Juliet. I'm not missing anything.
Nope.
Okay. Any questions or comments from the public? Okay, I'm not seeing anything come through either. Great, then we will move on. Thank you all again for that update. We'll be bringing much of this back to future meetings, as mentioned. I do want to, before I hand it over to Eric, who is going to talk about OPRs and the work that he's been leading up to update the Wildfire Hazard Technical Advisory Series. I do want to just welcome John Wentworth, who I think just joined. If you are here, John, I thought I saw you, but I'm lost in all my squares.
I am here. Hi, everybody. Great to see y'all.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you for joining, John.
TGIF. Yeah, there you go. Okay, thanks.
Or TAC. Okay, great. Wonderful. So thank you, John. And with that, I will hand it over to Eric. And Beth, who is also here with us.
Great. Thank you so much, Tara, for inviting Beth and I into the meeting today. Good to be back and once again in front of the Technical Advisory Council. As folks, many of you recall, we've been in front of you a few times just to provide sort of status updates, and we've provided, or you've provided us with some high-level feedback and comments just on things to consider along the way as we've been in this technical advisory update process. So here we are with the public draft. It was released several weeks ago, and we're excited to sort of present an overview for you today, and definitely looking forward to hear more robust discussion and comments today as we work towards wrapping up this public review process. So I do see that the PowerPoint is on the screen. If what I'm going to do, without any further ado, is launch into the presentation, and I'm going to hand it off to Beth, who's going to sort of give us just some high-level framing and statewide updates on where we're at with our wildfire problem in California. So go ahead and take it away, Beth.
Thank you so much, Juliet. And we can start with the next slide about brief history of wildfire in California. Thank you. So hello, everyone. My name is Beth Hotchkiss, and I'm speaking to you today from Sacramento, California. I'm currently on ancestral Nishanan land. And I wanted to start with this acknowledgement to first recognize the contributions of California's Native American tribes to our landscapes, and also for this presentation, acknowledge their role in fire management. When it comes to the history of fire in California, tribal ecological knowledge has and continues to be very important. Indigenous practices developed over many generations are based on the reality of fire. For instance, prescribed burning is one such practice traditionally used to maintain environmental health and promote resilience against catastrophic wildfire. But in California, fire management practices changed over the last century when colonizers enforced strict fire suppression regime at the expense of these more holistic land management practices, such as prescribed burning. And this shift definitely left our state more vulnerable to the impacts of wildfire. Today, we are continuing to grapple with this history while also figuring out how to make our communities fire adapted within the context of climate change and expanded growth in the wildland-urban interface. As many of you know, we are now facing an incredibly high-risk situation, which brings me to the next slide. As you can see from this chart, 2020 has certainly been a catastrophic year. Our state experienced 6 of the largest fires and wildfires in history, one of which burned over 1 million acres, marking California's first gigafire. Many of us, however, don't need to see this chart to know the severity of California's situation because we've lived through it. This year, I saw a lot of coworkers and friends being evacuated from homes, and the smoke, I think all of us remember, hung around our communities for days on end. And all of this on top of the ongoing pandemic. So looking forward, climate change is expected to exacerbate California's wildfire risks and hazards. According to California's 4th climate change assessment, if greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise, California will likely see a 50% increase in fires larger than 25,000 acres, as well as a potential 77% increase in average area burned by 2100. Now it's definitely more important than ever to focus on this topic and think about reducing our risk across California. Next slide, please. So one trend that we want to discuss today is the increased development in the wildland-urban interface, also known as the WUI, which can be broadly defined as any developed area where the wildland vegetation and built infrastructure allow for the ignition and spread of fire. This figure that you see here from a recent report shows an upward trend in the cumulative area of WUI burned over time. Part of this trend is due to the new development in the WUI. Roughly half of new homes in California have been built in the WUI since the 1990s. And currently 11 million people in California live in these areas, which is about a quarter of our population. Over 2 million homes are at high or extreme levels of risk, and an average of 5,000 homes are now lost to fires each year in California, a 10-fold increase from the second half of the 20th century. These losses are not only traumatic on a personal level to those living in the homes, but also bear a financial burden. The cost of wildfires in California now exceeds $10 billion per year in insured losses alone. Fire suppression, utility wildfire mitigation, disaster cleanup and recovery, and other costs in California have also resulted in even higher annual costs to public agencies. So what does this mean? It means that we need to work together across agencies to develop and implement a better framework for wildfire resilience so that we can chart a more sustainable path forward. I'm going to now pass it back to Eric, who will introduce our draft technical advisory update given this context.
Great. Thank you, Beth. Juliet, if you want to go to the next slide. And one more, please. Thank you so much. So we initiated, I think as we reported to you a few months back, that we initiated this last fall. So we've been in this process for about a year. And of course, there is some statutory direction in state law for OPR to initiate this update. This was pursuant to Senate Bill 901 and Assembly Bill 2911, which called for us to update this guidance document with a very specific task in mind, which was to look at land use strategies to reduce fire risk to buildings, infrastructure, and communities. So that's language is straight out of the law. We were required to update this document by this year, and also the bills also required us to update the document at least once every 8 years. So this technical advisory is complementary to OPR's general plan guidelines, and the intent of technical advisory documents is to provide more in-depth guidance on technical approaches to very specific general plan issues or requirements. And the goal, of course, of a technical advisory is not to restate all of the planning requirements already stated in our existing higher level documents like the general plan the general plan guidelines, but it's to provide more meaningful and specific guidance on specific issues. So we tend to try to not to reinvent the wheel, but definitely do cross-reference to the general plan guidelines and other planning tools where it's meaningful and appropriate. This technical advisory is not very old in its original format. The first time OPR did publish this was in 2015, and that was in response to a very specific new requirement, which I'll talk about later in the presentation. But we also realized that a lot had happened since 2015. The general plan safety element and some of the requirements, as many folks know, transformed in 2015 with a bill that passed known as 379. So just as the ink was drying on this fire hazard planning technical advisory, a brand new set of requirements was coming into play for the general plan safety element to address climate adaptation and resilience. So we took this opportunity in this update to look at all the great work already being done by our colleagues in the ICARP program, by Cal OES, to update the adaptation planning guide, as well as other stuff going on in planning and zoning law and other movements, to make sure that we're reframing and updating this document as much as possible to incorporate resilience, climate equity, addressing the needs of vulnerable communities and other critical issues that are needed so much in looking at the scale and the scope of disasters that we've experienced in recent years in California, knowing that much more needed to be done, especially about existing communities and vulnerable communities. And finally, I'll just quickly say too, that while we're required to do this work, we did take a lot of care to collaborate with our sister agencies within the state. CAL FIRE, the State Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, Cal OES, HCD, the Resources Agency, the Attorney General, just to name a few. So there was a lot of interagency collaboration and feedback. Also, we did consult and interview many local agencies, special fire districts, recovering communities where we've seen major disasters. So a lot of touch points with some of the stakeholders around the state that are already very attuned to the issue of how to address wildfire hazards and the need to do planning differently in California to address the challenge. Next slide, please. One of the things that the technical advisory does, in addition to some of the outline of the research and the scope and scale of our wildfire problem, as Beth indicated earlier in her part of the presentation, we did a pretty lengthy overview of the regulatory and policy background. And my intent is not to go over this confusing graphic in detail, but just note that there is a lot of documentation in that section of the technical advisory of some of the applicable laws, policies, agreements, regulations that already shape statewide and local responses to wildfire in California. And we try to focus on those in the document that are really most applicable to planning. And some of the on-the-ground regulations that can affect or shape planning, land use, development, and how we treat existing development on the ground today. And the key really in this section of the document is to understand how all these different plans, codes, standards, agreements align, and where they have different touch points with our efforts to promote wildfire resilience in California. So for local planning, as you look at this diagram, you see that our right-hand column highlights some of the planning tools that are in play and some of the incentives that are available. But of course, anything that we list in the federal level or state level eventually does get implemented locally. So we try to draw some of those connections here. It's not necessarily a perfect model, but just again to show that we do acknowledge that there's a lot of work that local agencies do depend on. And so the general plan isn't always necessarily the single tool for local agencies to be addressing fire hazards and risk. And I think local governments definitely know that. But just know that there is quite a bit of background information, and we try to arrange it in a way that it's meaningful and leads the reader from the regulatory background section into the actual planning guidance. Next slide, please. So quickly, before I hand it back off to Beth, I wanted to just reemphasize again that the general plan safety element, as I mentioned earlier, has evolved considerably in the last several years because of several bills. Most importantly, first, is that on the topic of wildfire, SB 1241, which was signed into law in 2012 and took effect in 2014, does require cities and counties that are in the state responsibility area. That's the area where CAL FIRE has primary suppression responsibility, as well as any local jurisdictions that have very high fire hazard severity zones that are outside of the state responsibility. These specific cities and counties in California must address some very specific wildfire hazard and risk reduction requirements in the safety element. Wildfire was already a topic prior to this bill, but the upping the ante and kind of increasing the scope of the analysis and policy making around wildfire was definitely transformed and changed by 1241. There was also a provision in SB 1241 that added review and comment authority to the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. So cities and counties now not only must update their general plans to address some very specific wildfire requirements, they also must submit that safety element to the Board of Forestry for review prior to adoption. Other key statutory changes that are more recent would be, of course, SB 379 and SB 1035, which tie the climate adaptation, all the updates that we've talked about in many different presentations to the TAC in terms of the adaptation planning guide. But obviously, the central legal requirements do nest in the general plan safety element. So that's an important consideration here. And just not a huge component, but a very important one in terms of wildfire planning considerations, evacuation routes. And there were two key bills that did pass the legislature in 2019 that also trigger some specific and analytical and documentation requirements for the adequacy of evacuation routes under different emergency scenarios. Next slide, please. Before I hand it off to Beth, I just did want to add, I forgot to say this on the last slide, but just adding that OPR definitely does recommend, and we tried to construct this fire hazard planning guidance in a way that local agencies consider aligning all of these different requirements together because they all rest in the same safety element. So definitely want to send that clear message as well, that we see this as a big opportunity for folks to be thinking holistically. So if we were talking about a technical advisory for flooding, technical advisory for other types of climate risks or hazards, we would probably want to send the same message, and we definitely do send that message in this guidance, as well as the APG and others. But anyway, I want to go ahead and turn it back over to Beth now, who's going to walk us through some guiding questions as we dive deeper into the technical advisory.
Thank you, Eric. So OPR's technical advisory update was very research driven, taking into account the latest thinking on reducing wildfire risk, examples and experiences from affected communities, and integrating best practices for analyzing hazards and reducing risk. Our technical advisory outlines planning processes, technical tools, studies, outreach and engagement methods that are all recommended for wildfire planning. So these guiding questions here highlight major themes from our technical advisory update. Our first question is, who should be engaged in the planning process? How do you determine the fire hazards and risks in a jurisdiction? How can we support populations that are vulnerable to wildfire? And what are specific land use strategies to reduce risk? And then finally, what are examples or resources that could help with this effort? So I'll be walking through some of those now. Next slide, please. So local agencies should engage residents, business owners, fire safe councils, and other stakeholders early in their planning process in order to establish an understanding of existing conditions, issues, and community concerns with regard to wildfire. Outreach and engagement efforts should also ensure that vulnerable and disadvantaged communities are properly identified and engaged as part of this process. Tribal governments should also be consulted as they have historical and traditional insight that could help with protecting cultural resources while also allowing for fire mitigation and suppression. In general, it's important to engage early and often. I'm sure you've heard this before, but it's very true because working collaboratively can help jurisdictions leverage resources, avoid duplication of efforts, and create a stronger planning process. Next slide, please. So as jurisdictions plan for wildfire, they must first determine wildfire hazards and risks. Our updated technical advisory identifies statutory requirements for what maps and data must be included in the analysis, but we also provide additional data sources, mapping tools, and guidance around how to characterize these hazards and risks. Our guidance is intended to help jurisdictions identify the intensity and likelihood of hazards, as well as determine the who and what in their community is most vulnerable to wildfire. This assessment should inform the general plan's land use alternatives analysis, as well as the policies and programs that get incorporated into their final general plan. Next slide, please. Supporting vulnerable community populations. So it's important to recognize that certain groups in a community are more vulnerable to the impacts of wildfire than others. For instance, in the past, counties struggled to provide Spanish speakers with timely emergency alerts and information, and elderly residents and persons with disabilities were less likely to escape when events did occur. Secondary impacts, such as wildfire smoke, have also had adverse impacts, particularly on outdoor workers and individuals with underlying health conditions. Through the fire hazard planning process, jurisdictions have an opportunity to identify these vulnerabilities and develop just and equitable solutions. These efforts should align with environmental justice and climate vulnerability requirements in the general plan where applicable. And next, I'm going to pass it back to Eric, who can talk more about reducing risk to existing communities.
Thanks, Beth. Next slide, please, Juliet. So I'm going to now walk through, there's really two aspects actually of how the technical advisor provides planning guidance on a more specific level. We're going to first talk about reducing risk to existing communities, and then we'll sort of get more into the land use and new development aspects of the guidance in a little bit later in the presentation. So as we talk to a lot of the stakeholders around the state and our fire agencies and those who deal with wildfire in prevention and preparedness work, there's a growing recognition on our part that we need to look at risks that exist in existing communities and really address those questions first. We knew that the land use strategy piece was our primary statutory charge, but as we talked to a lot of folks, it became clear that we need to get our house in order for existing development first, and then really move more into how to deal with the development of the future. Not that one is more important than the other, but we wanted to kind of set up that loading order first. So, so the real key question is, and this comes right out of the statutory language for the safety element, which is the purpose of the safety element is to avoid unreasonable risk, placing people and property and the sort of the viability of the community at unreasonable risk. That's the purpose of the safety element. So how do we avoid or minimize unreasonable risk when we're thinking about the existing developed areas of the community as well as what's to come? So there's really three key buckets here that I'll be talking about. One is just looking at where people live, where people do business, and retrofitting and protecting our older legacy existing development in the state. The second big bucket is around implementing sort of landscape level practices in our wildlands, in our vegetated areas of the WUI, and other parts of communities that need attention because they're vulnerable, and we haven't done the best job, as Beth highlighted in the introductory remarks. And then last but definitely not least is increasing the capacity of our communities and building resilience and how people are prepared for and are able to respond and recover from wildfire events. So let's go to the next slide to talk about that first bucket. So that, you know, when we talk about retrofitting and protecting existing development and buildings, people often first think of homes, which is important, but we're definitely looking across building typologies as well. So the different types of buildings that exist in California. But certainly the first and foremost thing is to harden structures and look at their buildings. We have a lot of older building stock that was not built to current wildland urban interface, or what we call the WUI codes, chapter 7A. So getting some of those buildings up to code in our most vulnerable areas of the state is a top priority. And we've seen the legislature take action on this. And we have programs like AB 38, PACE financing, and other tools that have been modified to allow us to do a better job of retrofitting and protecting existing development. Defensible space is part of this as well. There's hardening the structure, but there's also the important regulatory tools we already have to do vegetation thinning and keeping vegetation away from homes and buildings. One of the biggest causes of fire is not the wall of flames. In a wildfire event, it's the ember casting. It's the little bits of fire that are basically being thrown into neighborhoods by winds. So this is one of the top priorities now, is looking at defensible space and making it more effective. And some of the financing tools that I mentioned are directly aimed more so at defensible space than they actually are at hardening existing structures. But definitely this is a top priority. And we know that general plans don't necessarily change these rules, but local governments can think more strategically about how to implement these programs and help to scale up neighborhood-wide solutions. A lot of the research tells us that defensible space isn't effective if not everyone is doing it. So doing it at scale and making sure that we're seeing sort of area-wide conformity can really help to increase resilience and provide better outcomes in the event of a disaster. Next slide, please. The second bucket we need to talk about is the landscape. It's the wildland, it's the vegetated parts of our WUIs, and obviously there's a lot that needs to happen here. You'll hear the fire agencies talk about a top priority, which is fuel modification, which is the activity of addressing vegetation and its susceptibility in a wildfire. Obviously, the more we do to thin forests, to keep them healthy, to remove dead and accumulated vegetation. There's a lot of different methods for this. Beth mentioned the traditional practice of prescribed burning, which we're trying to bring back in California, as well as other methods. And of course, the major focus here is on understory and thinning, but also overall forest thinning as well. Now, wildfires really aren't just necessarily a coniferous forest problem. Wildfires can basically occur in any landscape in California. So as folks probably don't remember, not too long ago, this is in our worst wildfire season on record, we had 2 major fires that burned almost entirely in grassland and oak woodland. So while the biggest fire we've had on record definitely was more in coniferous forest, a lot of the risks that we have in California is actually in other land cover types, whether it's chaparral, oak woodland, coastal scrub, and other biomes and regimes. So the idea is to do this work not just in the forests, but statewide, and do this in a context-sensitive way. There's also landscape scale measures that are directly aimed at increasing resilience, whether we're talking about fire breaks, fuel breaks, shaded fuel breaks, even using land use tools like agriculture, the important role that agriculture can play in protecting agriculture at the urban or WUI edge, and providing a buffer between wildfire areas is important. Open spaces, any type of open space, managed open space, can also serve as an important buffer zone. So really looking at sort of these natural working land solutions as fire mitigations, as well as the value of the lands that the value of those lands have themselves are highly important. Want to also highlight that there is some discussion in the technical advisory about sort of the regulatory process around landscape management and fuel modification in particular. You know, our fire agencies just did a big EIR called the California Vegetation Treatment Program EIR that does cover a lot of these management practices in the state responsibility area. Local governments have an opportunity to not just hear from that EIR, but to mirror this approach. And so what some of the guidance that we do talk about as well is the opportunity to leverage safety elements, integrated safety elements, local hazard mitigation plans, even community wildfire protection plans, and making sure that those plans are specific enough and have the right CEQA coverage so that there can be some streamlining opportunity for these activities. So that definitely is within local government's planning and environmental purview, and want to highlight that as a strategy as well. Next slide, please. The last big thing is increasing community capacity and resilience. So obviously this has already been mentioned by Beth in some of the framing earlier, but the prioritizing the needs of vulnerable communities continues to be just a rallying, centering piece of this aspect of reducing risk in existing communities. Definitely want to make sure that the guidance does talk about increasing local capacity to prepare, evacuate, and recover from wildfire events. Really preparing the community for this work as well. It's not just about the agencies themselves being ready, but making sure that the work on the ground is being done to prepare residents and to know where our most vulnerable community members live, and making sure that they have the resources and are notified early, and that there's a plan for where to bring people. And what happens when people can't get out? Are there safe zones or refugia available so that people are protected? The evacuation routes legislation I mentioned earlier, the bills from 2019 are definitely part of the strategy. So some of the technical piece is mentioned in the advisory. And the last but not least thing is, looking at planning for compounding and cascading hazard events such as flooding and landslides, water contamination, and other issues, especially around temporary housing needs, are really important issues that local agencies should be thinking about in their general plans. Next slide, please. So that brings us through reducing risk in existing communities. I think the next series of slides will be talking about definitely the future development, land use strategy, and how to avoid and minimize unreasonable risks through land use planning and development review. And here we have three really big buckets. The first one is starting upstream. This is kind of the land use planning work that happens before development specific proposals are even considered. There is local solutions that happen through planning and development review that we'll talk about, and then last, aligning efforts across plans, codes, and standards. Next slide, please. So when we talk about starting upstream, we're talking about the planning process itself. So, the general plan through the housing element, through the land use element, the work that's being done in the safety element, there's a real need to tie these different elements together. Of course, there's a lot of good guidance in this already in the general plan guidelines, as well as the updated adaptation planning guide. But when we're talking deliberately about something as specific as wildfire, in talking with a lot of our state agencies, example local agencies that have struggled, we're finding that a lot of the policymaking and planning work is done sort of after the general plan. And there isn't a lot of attention still being paid to integrating considerations of hazards and risks when a community is opening up its general plan and deciding when and where and how to grow. And what are the new growth areas? Where should growth be prioritized? What sort of that community or even sometimes regional scale set of questions about what's the right pattern of development, what areas of the community to open up or avoid. So, often this is done through a land use scenarios or an alternatives analysis, and our recommendations in the guidance really speak to that opportunity to use data and use scenario modeling and integrate hazards and risk into that process. We really want to see folks weigh the cost, benefits, and trade-offs of different approaches with respect to addressing wildfire risk. And ultimately, our recommendations aren't super specific on this because every community is different. And in different communities, some communities have high hazard areas or high risk areas that are more on their edges, and some communities exist wholly within high hazard areas. So we want to make sure folks understand that we left a lot of flexibility in the guidance, knowing that context is highly important. We know that some communities very much want to grow into the WUI or expand the WUI footprint in their region, and others are really seriously considering the costs and trade-offs of such actions. So knowing that everyone's in a different space with this, tried to provide some contextual guidance on what sort of patterns or land use tools or decision-making frameworks need to be in place to affect those outcomes. Obviously, we know that local agencies need to consider their own financial risk, the cost of disaster cleanup and recovery. Are folks even thinking about these issues? And then, of course, considering long-term resilience and sustainability, and not really only focusing on short-term needs or interests. Next slide, please. Looking at local solutions, apart from the sort of macro scale general plan update process, there are many situations where we continue to see and will continue to see new housing, new development, new land uses proposed in areas with elevated hazard or risk. And knowing that this is going on, and this will probably go on for a while, if new growth does occur in the wildland-urban interface, we need to make sure that the right mix of policies and implementing mechanisms are in place to really help to mitigate unreasonable risk. And so some tools are suggested in the guidance around using general plan designations, overlay zoning, making sure that those specific tools and those designation areas are key to the hazard and risk assessment. So really using the data-driven process around hazard and risk analysis to help define what those areas might be. Of course, local governments have a wide degree of flexibility in terms of the types of restrictions or special standards or use prohibitions that can be put into place. There's also recommendations on the development review process itself in terms of what should happen when a project gets proposed. What's the process for analyzing hazards and risk? If it hasn't been done well at the programmatic or the planning level, what are some mechanisms that can be used at the project level to make sure that the outcomes are good and that we have fire adapted and resilient development built where there is elevated hazard and risk? Some communities have used project-specific fire protection plans. Know a number of communities that are already doing this. So there's some cross-references to some of those case studies and examples in the document. And I think there's a lot of different flavors of what community scale risk reduction measures can be used, whether it's general plan level, zoning level, or even sometimes design criteria level, whether it's again, using roads as fire breaks, limiting development to only one side of the road has been often cited by some of the experts as an easy win in terms of reducing risk at the vegetated edge. Ridgeline protection, setbacks, slope standards, making sure there's adequate ingress and egress as part of subdivision design, and making sure that those areas connect to well signed and well trained evacuation route procedures for communities. Fire adapted landscaping standards. So there's just a lot of best practice that's sort of listed in the guidance that can speak to local solutions and very specific measures that can be incorporated into development review. Next slide, please. The last big focus area for land use and new development, really, this almost spans both existing and new, but we threw it under land use here just for the sake of closing out this present part of the presentation, which, again, very important principle at play throughout the guidance is to align efforts. We want to make sure that local agencies are thinking about harmonizing the opportunity for using nature-based solutions, conservation and open space standards with hazard and risk reduction. So that can look like policies that are consistent across the safety element, land use element, and conservation and open space. So really just looking at that macro level approach and making sure that there's no conflicts or inconsistent approaches. We really want to have folks thinking about planning to rebuild efficiently in a manner that increases resilience after disaster, and a lot of lessons learned from recovering communities have been incorporated into the document to sort of paint the picture of how to build resilience and prepare for rebuilding from wildfires when they occur. And last but not least, we've emphasized this already, just the many different planning tools that are available and how to leverage and maximize, especially on funding. The local hazard mitigation plan, as many agencies know, there is a strong incentive to incorporating your local hazard mitigation plan into the safety element. It unlocks an important state funding opportunity for FEMA funding. So we might want to make sure that that's highlighted here as well. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Beth.
Thanks, Eric. And we can go to the next slide. So we recognize that OPR is not the first to publish guidance on this topic, and there's a lot of good resources out there already. So in our technical advisory update, we tried to highlight as many of these existing resources as possible. Our TA includes example policies and programs, funding sources, guidance documents, tools and data sets, case studies, as well as links to peer learning and support programs, such as the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire, the CPAL program, as well as the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. And if any of the council members have additional resources that they'd like to include in the guidance, we're all ears and just beefing this up and making it the best as possible. So we can go to our next slide now. So I'd like to remind everyone that this is a document that's currently open and out for public content. And I know that we're going to be going into a discussion here very soon, but if you have additional comments or resources that you'd like to send to us, we encourage you to go through our draft fire hazard planning technical advisory and also submit comments through OPR's public comment submission form. You can submit your comments through both our form or upload a letter as you please. And we're having all comments due by December 18th. So that's coming up in about a week now. With that, I will go to our last slide and open it up to additional questions. And just as a reminder too, if you have any additional questions that we don't get to today, you can also send us an email at wildfireta@opr.ca.gov.
Thank you to both Eric and Beth for that amazing presentation and just wealth of information and all the hard work that has been going on over the last year to pull this together. So now we'll open it up. I think we have some council members who great have raised hands. We did get a note in, I think in the queue, we've got John Wentworth, and then Michelle sent a note over. So I'll read that after John goes, and then Jason Greenspan. And so if other council members have questions or comments you want to make, please raise your hand and we'll add it to the queue. So John Wentworth, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you very much. Mammoth Lakes, as I've shared with you guys, I think many times before, we have lived through this process. Our general plan is updated. And I want to just reemphasize a couple of very important resources for anybody who represents a jurisdiction, whether you're a county or a town. The Community Prevention Against Wildfire program, which is administered through a group called Headwaters Economics, which was mentioned in the presentation. They're on the radio a lot these days. They're on NPR, they're in the national press. Any jurisdiction can apply for a grant that provides a whole suite of technical assistance to deal with all those WUI issues, and also to help your local jurisdiction deal with what's going to be a pretty heavy lift to get your general plan updated and your local codes and all the rest of it to be in conformity with that. It is a priceless resource. It's free, it doesn't cost you any money, and they bring big game to the table. So I just wanted to make sure that I just put a big shout out to that group. Sign up. It was critical for the work that we did making this happen. I'm going to look at maybe providing some comments. We have lived here in Mammoth Lakes with the creek fire for over, was it 3 or 4 months? The fire's still not out. I mean, we've gotten a little bit of snow, but it's still lurking out there. It may be coming right back in the spring. And I want to really commend the state of California for that shared stewardship agreement. For those of us out there where our WUI is federal public lands, that is a critical document. And I think as we all move forward into the Biden administration and what kind of guidance is going to be coming out of our federal partners, we've got some very interesting and very important opportunities moving forward. The presentation was great. Thank you very much for that. And I look forward to providing some comments as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, John. So there was a question from Michelle here, and she asked if we are considering additional co-benefits of changes in land use, such as more infill, less building in the WUI, and connections with VMT reduction, in addition to fire risk.
Yeah, that definitely is, I think the answer is yes. We definitely recognize those co-benefits, and they're highlighted in a few places in the guidance. I think that some of the work that we're doing, I know, is supported by a lot of the folks advocating for this sort of thinking both about hazard mitigation, reducing risk, increasing resilience, also helps us to meet our overall state planning priorities for compact development, reducing vehicle miles traveled. So definitely thanks for raising that. And we definitely do recognize those benefits, and we'll continue to promote those both in this guidance as well as forthcoming work.
Great, thank you, Eric. So next up is Jason, and then I'm just checking my list here, and then David Loya.
Thanks very much. The focus on defensible space and existing communities is something I think it's really valuable. And I'm wondering if you address in the guidance the potential friction between increasing urban forest and the tree canopy within the WUI and this notion of defensible space. We wrestle with this kind of guidance, and I just want to make sure that we're not getting into a maladaptive space. Personally, where I live in Southern California, I had a front row view to the Bobcat fire. And I've noticed in the subsequent months, many properties, and I happen to also live within the WUI, are clearing trees. And that's really running contrary to my city's approach to increase the urban forest and tree canopy. And I'm just wondering if you have the opportunity to address that dynamic and if you have any suggested solutions in the guidance.
A great comment. I think there's a few, at least one or two places where we do acknowledge that there may be trade-offs between actions to reduce wildfire risk in different contexts. So I don't necessarily have the magic silver bullet to address that potential conflict. I know that there have been some communities that have kind of tried to address that about where to prioritize tree planting, where maybe there's areas where you don't do that, especially at the edges of your WUI or places that are at elevated risk. Maybe that requires some special modeling or understanding of wind patterns or areas where trees just aren't a good idea, but maybe there are parts of regions that could potentially be subject to wildfire but are less vulnerable or where the benefits of trees outweigh the risk. So I think that's really a local issue, and that recognizing that trade-off, and maybe if there are folks on this call or comments that come in about those examples, we would love to hear about them and highlight how folks have navigated those trade-offs.
Thanks very much.
Great. So next up is David Loya and then Andrea.
Hey there. First, I just want to recognize Eric's point that this is so complex. It's not just magic, and it's not just a silver bullet. It requires a magic silver bullet to work out. And so maybe these comments are maybe not going to get us very far, but you know, it struck me as I was listening to the presentation, which was very informative, and I appreciate very much. You know, a couple pieces. One, you know, the nexus between land use planning, infill, and you know, trying to stay out of the WUI. I just found myself kind of gravitating towards perhaps including the wildland-urban interface as a required component of regional housing allocation. Right now, you know, it's a jobs housing balance is the only thing that's required. And then the COG can take into consideration any other metrics that are of import to that community. Perhaps, you know, in order to really drive infill planning and resolve, you know, multiple different climate adaptations requirements, we can you know, make recommendations for including something as simple as, you know, proportion of wildland-urban interface. I know for our regional housing needs allocation in Humboldt County, because the county does have a large proportion of the jobs and ultimately, you know, our methodology was largely based on that. The county has a lion's share of our housing allocation, which also has the lion's share of the wildland-urban interface. So that's an idea for, you know, some practical solution, maybe not a magic silver bullet, but a little practical application. And then I also started thinking about when you were talking early, Eric, about you know, making structures resilient. I just wonder if there are some ways, and this is just, you know, really unformulated thought, so I'm a little embarrassed saying it, but I'm wondering if there are ways to develop building practices that would have multiple adaptive results, and so you could have something that was, you know, both, you know, less reflective and also, you know, fire adaptive, and it's just baked into the building codes. Because I'm thinking about places like Arcata, which has a pretty extensive wildland-urban interface, but we don't really have a high fire risk at this point. And it sort of begs the question, you know, how do you get a jurisdiction like ours to start thinking about, you know, as climate changes, where, you know, we're going to have higher fire risk in the future, and at the same time, we're going to build hundreds of buildings between now and then that are going to be not fire adapted. So how do we get to the point where we're building fire resilient buildings now? So there's just a couple thoughts I was thinking. Thanks for letting me talk.
That's great, thank you. And Eric, in case you or Beth had anything to follow up on that, just quick before I hand it over to Andrea.
I just reaffirm that, David. Thanks for those comments. And I think that, you know, that's a great thing for our agencies that are regulating the building code to take into consideration. And we know some of those discussions are ongoing about some of the transformative changes needed in adaptive design. You know, HCD, we've had a few discussions with HCD as well, the Building Standards Commission, about those sorts of issues. And I know that CAL FIRE is very actively engaged as well. I will say that what some of the way we frame this in some of the guidance is because the guidance isn't really for building codes, but the policy principle at play is the precautionary principle that local agencies can adopt more protective building codes and standards. And that can be a policy commitment in an adaptation strategy and a safety element of a general plan. So making sure that that message was clear was our goal, that we're not trying to rewrite the codes through this advisory, but definitely pointing to examples where agencies have taken initiative. I recall talking to the Orange County Fire Authority. They go far above and beyond the defensible space standard, for example, and there have been communities that have decided to adopt their own supplements to the WUI code to make sure that those codes are more protective in elevated areas of risk. So definitely appreciate that comment, and we'll be looking for hopefully comments from the public too on how to approach that in planning guidance as well, and not cross wires with some of our other agencies.
Great, thanks, Eric. Andrea, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you. Great presentation, by the way. Thank you very much. I swear I didn't collude with David on our comments, but I think everything he said I concur with, and I'd like to build on a little bit more. So in terms of the RHNA allocation, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, we're just going through in the Bay Area the methodology to which we assign the units. And we have over 400,000 units that we're planning for in the next planning period. And because the methodology has resulted in more units, given the different factors that the methodology committee considered to develop the methodology, but the methodology also considered allocating more units, considering equity issues. So in areas that are high resources, that are considered, high opportunity areas where units in previous planning periods were not necessarily as assigned, or the weighting wasn't quite as great as it is now. The result is that many of the units in our next planning period will be in areas of the WUI in unincorporated county areas that have challenges with respect to not only transportation, but infrastructure, and that are maybe even by voter approval in areas where there's an urban growth boundary. So we have some fairly significant tension points, I think, moving forward. And I think David's point is a really good one. If there could be some factors that are baked into what we consider when we're considering the next round methodology that remove discretion from the equation, this may help try to balance the scales, because we're balancing having to plan for specific sites that can accommodate these units. And we're talking about, exponentially more units than we had the previous round to try to address the overall housing emergency that we have in the state. So I know this is somewhat rambling, but I guess my point being is that we should remove discretion whenever we can from the local authority. And I'm saying this clearly not in self-interest, but in a framework of trying to achieve some level of balance. Because with each of our efforts, whether it's the RHNA, whether it's climate adaptation, or our updates of our general plan, there's always going to be at the local level a political tapestry that influences those individual decisions. And in as much as we can remove that from the equation, I think we'll find a much better balance and a much maybe more effective and consistent way of addressing these large scale issues. And then just as an aside, I too am interested in seeing the building codes be much more, removing some discretion from the local governments, because while Orange County and their fire authority may be way ahead of things, there are a tremendous amount of variation in local governments as to what the tolerance is for approval of local amendments to the uniform codes. So again, not working in my own self-interest here, but if you can remove discretion from those decisions, we may get a much more consistent result.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Just again, you're hitting it so hard on the head. It's so loud. It's this is what we've heard at every step of the process for the last year, is this tension between resolving our housing crisis in the state, but building a more resilient future. And this is exactly the conversations we need to be having about what tweaks do we make to the regulatory environment? What guidance do we give to the general plan, which isn't regulatory in a direct way? And so how do we nest a planning approach here that can guide people into those local decisions? I do like the idea that we take the discretionary piece away, but I think, as we all know, that is a very difficult thing to do in the current political environment right now. So we keep thinking about these tools and opportunities and keep having those conversations. So again, thank you so much.
Great, thank you. I don't have any other council member comments or questions here queued up. One last call there. Okay, seeing nothing here. Are there any questions or comments from the public who are on with us today? Okay, thank you, Eric and Beth, again so much for the presentation and all your work. I'm wondering, can you just remind folks again the deadline for comment in case people want to send in additional comments?
Yeah, absolutely. It's 1 week from today, Friday the 18th. And I'll go ahead and drop a chat to the portion of our website that has the comment submission form and some of the FAQs and so forth.
Great, thank you so much. And just a quick note to kind of a logistics side here, there is all of the materials and slides that you've seen today are on our website. There was an update made to the deck that you just saw, so we're going to be replacing the deck that's currently online with the one you saw there, but no kind of major substantive changes to the content there. But just a note that you can always access all the materials and slides from our presentations on our website. We can also add that into the chat here too. With that, we'll wrap up this item. It's just a few minutes after noon here, so we will be taking a break. We will pause for an hour for lunch and for people to step away and deal with whatever you need to, aside from our meeting today. So if you all could be back just at, why don't we say 1:05, so we give people a full hour here, and then we will reconvene the meeting. Thank you, everybody, for a great morning so far, and looking forward to coming back after lunch. Thank you. For those of you who just joined, we're just going to get started here in a couple minutes. We were taking a bit of a lunch break. It's a full day Zoom meeting, so we're giving people a break in the middle of the day. So those who have just joined, we're just waiting for a few more folks to sign back in, and we will get started. Thanks to everybody who's here. And welcome to our Department of Insurance friends who have joined on the line. I'm excited to have you here today. While we're waiting for a few more folks to join us, just for anybody who has joined us since the lunch break, just a reminder that we ask everyone to please keep your line muted when you're not speaking, just to avoid background noise, minimize the background noise. And then also for anybody who is joining, we will have public comment after each agenda item. For both council and members of the public who want to make a comment, please use the raise the hand feature, and we will be setting up a queue for people to comment and for discussion. So just a couple quick logistics before we kick off again after our lunch break for those who are just joining us. We're just going to give people one more minute because we did say we would start at 1:05 and it's just 1:05. So just giving people one more minute. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get going here. So again, welcome to everybody for the second half of our quarterly meeting of the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Programs Technical Advisory Council. Thanks to everyone who's sticking with it for the long Zoom day, but hopefully the first part of the day was useful for everybody. We definitely enjoyed the conversation and appreciate everybody's thoughtful input and engagement in the morning. So this afternoon is really just focused on updates from our side around the next steps of the council's work group meetings and work group, efforts, and some upcoming meetings we're going to be teeing up for the coming year. So just to recap a little bit as we get, and then I'm going to hand it over to Juliet to take us into the detail here. But as we talked about at the top of the meeting with the state updates, we are looking to update the state adaptation strategy in 2021. We talked a bit about that, and just a reminder that as we are looking to the council's work and engagement in that process, one of the things we have talked about for the last few months here is the need to better develop resilience metrics that will help us track our progress over time. So I just want to again highlight that connection, that this work that we are teeing up and that Juliet's going to go over is really going to be important contribution and feed into the next update of the state adaptation strategy. And then we are also joined here by our colleagues from the California Department of Insurance to give an update on our partnership work with them. So with that, I'm going to hand it now over to Juliet, who is going to carry us through this agenda item.
Great. Hi, thank you. So I'm Juliet Hart, and Program Manager for the ICARP program. So the first one that we will talk about, if I can get my slide to advance, is the insurance subgroup. So just to refresh, because it's been a little bit since the last time we all talked about this, this is a subgroup that's formed as a partnership between the California Department of Insurance and ICARP. And so we have 2 members from the ICARP Council and 2 members from the SB 30 Climate Change Insurance Working Group that's run out of CDI. And so the 2 members from the council that we have representing us are Jason Greenspan and Andrea Aus. And then from the SB 30 side are Caitlin Rudner-Gardner and Serena Sowers, or Sowers. Sorry, I haven't met her yet, so I don't know how to pronounce her last name. So hopefully I didn't say it wrong. Caitlin is with EDF and Serena is with the Department of Insurance. And the original charge of this was to just start to take apart some of the challenges that we're dealing with in terms of insurance and climate change and natural hazards. And so the first subgroup meeting was held on June 3rd. And really that was a time to have a chance to kind of talk about the different issues from both sides of the conversation, from the insurance side, from the planning side, and the adaptation and resilience world side. And what they decided upon at that point was to develop this kind of 3-step process. And we're going to walk through that today. And I'm actually just going to immediately turn it over to Mike Peterson, who is the Deputy Commissioner for Climate and Sustainability, I believe, with the Department of Insurance. And then I also just wanted to note that Deborah Halberstadt is on as well. And she has come on with the Department of Insurance over this little hiatus from the last meeting. And so she is the, let me get it right, the Senior Climate Policy Advisor. So she'll be joining the conversation as well. But we've sort of identified this 3-fold process. So we'll walk you through it and talk about some of the proposed products. And then at the end, share kind of our next steps in the process that we anticipate moving forward with this. So I will go to the next slide, and then Mike, are you there?
Thanks very much, Juliet. Appreciate it. And hello, everyone. Hope everyone's doing very well. And thanks for inviting me back to talk to you all about insurance. I also want to say thank you. You know, we over in the Department of Insurance have been using a couple of the documents that this group has put together, including those on vulnerable communities. And so just appreciate all your work. And it's always good to know that it's being used. So thank you. So today I want to talk to you about these 3 steps as Juliet outlined. You know, as the subgroups met, they've identified a couple goals, and they mainly focus on communication and building the scaffolding for us to be able to work together over the long run. And so step 1 was to build a short, concise, understandable insurance primer that addressed sort of basic questions on how insurers and reinsurers operate, how they approach climate risk, at what level and scale does that occur, and then also how this might change in the future. And I think that's really important because all of us, whether we're in insurance or in climate adaptation or in governance, you know, think about risk. But if that's not aligned with how insurers are thinking about risks, then we have a mismatch. And so this opportunity for this primer is a chance for us to build a common language, and so that we can start conversations from the point of understanding the opportunities and not just kind of digging into the details of how insurance works or how planning works or how climate adaptation works. So I think this is a really exciting first step. And the 4 members of this subgroup have worked hard on this and gotten a chance to kind of piece together what are the key questions, and then how do we go about providing like really nice, concise answers to them. So these are the questions that you see on the screen here that were identified by the subgroup as the most critical to communicate to this wider group. And as you'll notice, the majority of them have to do with the fundamental basics of how insurance works in the state, and they build towards what you might use to apply to a more landscape level, which I think is of core interest to both of our organizations. So I won't read through every question, but you can see that on the list. And those are the questions that are reflected in the draft primer that we've produced thus far. Julia, you can move to the next slide. So what this sets up, and I guess I should have said at the end of it, so the draft primer is in your materials there and does try to answer those questions as best as we could. And I think that today's a good opportunity to discuss whether those, actually, Julia, just bounce back the slide. I jumped the gun there just slightly. Thank you. Sorry about that. So when we're looking at these questions, here's our main kind of directive to this group is to look at them. These seem to us as the most critical questions. There are thousands more that are probably there, but we want to sort of have this be something that's a tangible, condensed primer. And so as you're reading this, kind of look at, you know, are these questions ones that kind of capture you in terms of what you think is most important to know? Could they slightly be tweaked to be more relevant? And then as you look at the answers, you know, the hope is that this primer is understandable to a wide audience so that, you know, this group and others are able to use it as the backbone of their conversation. Thanks. All right, go ahead and move to the next slide. So what this sets up is a step 2, which is if we're developing an insurance primer so that we understand the language of insurance, then we want to mesh that with a planning primer so that we have the language of planning. And at that level, with those combined, we're going to be able to really move this conversation forward and propose specific things that are solutions to problems that have been identified. And so this planning primer is still is not in the planning stage of the planning primer. And it focuses on these questions: how do local and tribal governments approach climate risk at the local and regional level? So there you have a mixture of what kind of jurisdiction you have and what kind of spatial area you're looking at. And then how do they approach mitigation of risk, and how could this be addressed differently in the future? And again, that's going from how have we done things historically? What are the reasons for that? And can those be adapted to what we know or project is going to happen in the future? So this will be the next step for this subgroup. Juliet, you can move to the next slide. And so what we think that will be a major value of that is not, once we've built this education and kind of like backbone of information, we can then have a crosswalk and look at opportunities for projects, data collection, and research. And that's important to both of our groups because the Department of Insurance, in addition to regulating insurance, does collect data on insurance. And so the degree to which that can be used and most effectively is important. This group is producing documents that inform local governance, inform regional governance, and climate adaptation. And so there are opportunities for both research and data collection, and also proposing of new projects. And so this crosswalk will take a look at these 3 bullet points. How can different jurisdictions leverage their existing insurance products and policies to advance climate mitigation and adaptation efforts? What can be done to improve implementation of community scale adaptation? And how can adaptation and resilience measures at scale provide improved insurance coverage and affordability? And I think that this is a 3-step process that makes a lot of sense, provides tangible, practical documents, and puts us in a place to really provide long-term opportunities for research and further work. In terms of next steps, we have here the schedule lined up that the subgroup is going to implement. And so we have a winter working group meeting, which is today, to refine the insurance primer. Then in March, the winter working group will happen after this meeting, which will refine the insurance primer subject to any thoughts and revisions and ideas from this group. At the March TAC meeting, there'll be a chance to refine the planning primer, discuss those crosswalks and opportunities. A spring sub-working group meeting to finalize those primers and get them to the point where we feel like we're producing these final documents. And then in June, to review and approve a final document. Okay, next slide. Wonderful. So for discussion today, I know that we have a couple of our subgroup members here. I don't want to put them on the spot, but if they'd like to speak, they're welcome to. But in general, you've gotten a copy of the primer. We really want this to be useful to this group. And so we'd love to hear your comments on revisions or extensions or objections. So thank you very much for the chance to speak, and I'll pass it back to Juliet from here.
Thank you, Mike. And also Taylor Carnevale, our new exec fellow, just put the link to the primer in the chat, so you can look at it in real time if you didn't have a chance to look at it before. And what I might do is go back a couple slides and maybe sit on the first one with the insurance primer. And I think we just wanted to have some time to chat about, are these the right, are there other questions that you think we've missed in this insurance primer? You can do this in whatever order you like, but we would like to get some feedback on that. Think about what you all think needs to go into the planning primer, and then ultimately what would be, what are the questions that you want to see addressed once we sort of have this common language. So for right now, I'll sit on this first one, but I'm happy to advance the slide to whichever one that people want to address. And so we can use the same process as before, where raise your hand. We'll try to go in order, but yeah, we're open to conversation around the primer.
Great, thank you so much. I see David Loya has his hand up. Start there.
Thank you, Noah and Tara. I guess one of the things as I'm looking at this list, my first thought when I read the question, to what extent do insurers consider the issues of equity and social justice? My assumption is that they don't. I think there needs to be a follow-up question to this because, insurance is looking at sort of a meta level, more than likely, what sort of a metadata level considerations, and not really digging into sort of the implications of that meta-analysis. And so, it strikes me that, the likely answer is no. And so there needs to be some sort of a follow-up question that really digs into, what can policy do to shift the impact of, lack of consideration for equity and social justice. In many of these meetings, we've identified that vulnerable communities and that people of color are, subjected to disproportionately to the impacts of climate change. And if the insurance decisions are being made on, the basis of sort of cold hard facts about what jurisdictions are doing in their hazard mitigation plans and so on and so forth, but the jurisdictions, of vulnerable communities don't have those resources to make those plans, are going to be disproportionately affected, and it just reinforces sort of the systemic racism that the systems naturally promote. So I would suggest developing some sort of a follow-up question that addresses those issues.
And if I could just jump in with one quick comment. Thanks, David. I appreciate that. I think that there's two ways to think about insurance's relationship to equity and social justice. One is in the pricing, which tends to be the cold hard facts, and one is the availability, which is more discretionary to the insurance companies as far as what products do you make available to the public. And there's a lot of variability out there, I would say, in approaches to this, but at least at like the highest level of kind of international companies, there's a certain number of companies who made commitments to trying to offer products that meet the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, which tend to fall into things like alleviating poverty, preparing for climate, and things like that. And so there is sort of I think kind of an open question of like, how well is that going to work? How, broad are those commitments? What are the specific details? Is there a regulatory piece of that puzzle that has yet to be realized? So anyway, so just to kind of give you that sense, there is both the what types of products are offered and also how are they priced. And I think both, have equity and justice questions.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. I think next up we've got Brian Strong.
Hi, thanks, Mike. Good to see you. This is Brian Strong with the City and County of San Francisco. I know we've worked together, we've been in a couple of meetings over the past couple of years. So I like the primer. I mean, I think it's great to have it. I guess I'm looking for more details and more information. And some of it, like when we were just talking about how insurance is priced, I think that's part of the black box that people are trying to understand, and that I think get to some of these issues around, why aren't insurance companies recognizing the benefits of social justice more, or of equity, as it could directly have an impact on the bottom line for the types of properties that they're insuring, or for interruption insurance, or for some of those other, for some of their other priorities. So I'm wondering if we can get a little more detail in there. And to me, that kind of gets to this bigger question, which is, I think my frustration always is that I think insurance industry, they have they have access to certain data and information that other people don't have access to, and maybe that's part of how they establish their rates. But if we, the public, or as public sector employees or community organizations had access to that same information, or at least understood how they were making those decisions, maybe just greater transparency, then we could, I think, better understand some of the decisions that are being made and some of the inequities that sort of get perpetuated. So those are sort of two two things that I've identified that I don't know how much detail you can go into on the insurance primer, but I do think there would be more work there. And finally, I think, we've talked with your office and with the Nature Conservancy and other folks around trying to capture future value. And I think when I say capture future value, capture the future value of resilience work, equity work, or those types of things. And we know there are some examples where there have been nature-based solutions that where you're able to sort of capture that value and then bond against it. But they're really few and far between. And I think since the insurance company has so much to gain from these resilience investments, I'm trying to understand if there's a way we can start to delve into producing some real products that could help us fund these efforts that we've been talking about all day. So those are all my questions.
Absolutely. So it sounds like that maybe a little bit more detail on the how is insurance priced, and not just how is it priced, but maybe like why are some things not included and some things included? Does that seem like a good way to kind of provide some extra information for in response to your question?
Yes, no, for sure. And I think, and we have examples too, like with where, and I think you do mention a little bit about what happens when you cannot find insurance, but there have been times, right, where your office, where the insurance commissioner has to step in, otherwise we would not be able to get any insurance, right? If you think about earthquake insurance or those types of things. So
yeah,
I think
that makes sense. And maybe tying those two together. I mean, just to kind of give this group a little bit of an initial response to that question is, oftentimes what's included in insurance pricing is somewhat discretionary to the insurance company who's coming and trying to justify that price. So if they come with 402 variables, my department will have to assess, whether that's justifiable. If they come from 2 variables, as long as that meets regulations, we'll have to decide if that's justifiable. And so in some cases, the regulations, do say you have to have these components. But adding further components is certainly something that's a possibility. So I think I can frame this in a way that sounds like it would be helpful. Hopefully not too long, but be helpful. And then hopefully, does that sound like a reasonable way to move forward on that? Okay.
At least for me, I don't want to speak for everyone else on the committee.
Oh no, yeah.
But yeah.
Just want to be sure I take the right notes down. So no, thanks, Brian. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. I think up next we've got Janna Gannon.
Hi, so this is, it's really exciting to do this work because I think that all of us are eager to understand more about the opportunities that the insurance industry can help us create to do a just and manageable transition to more of a climate smart, organized, built environment than we have now. And so when we talk about, listening to Brian's comments, and in our own planning, we are really racing to keep up with the risk factors that climate change presents, both for our insurance policies, but also, of course, for just, core operations. And so I guess my question or comment about the second bullet from the bottom, what tools and factors do insurers use to develop the risk thresholds? I'm wondering if we could include in a primer a discussion. I understand your point that insurers make the presentation of the factors that they are considering, but I'm wondering if we can put a section in there about more of the climate risk factors that your office is seeing being presented as increasing risks of consideration. And so, because what we've seen on the ground and it's caused pain out there is that insurance has been affordable, and then all of a sudden it's not available. So there's not like this sort of carrot and the stick around using kind of a gradual increase in insurance premiums to drive behavior into more sort of climate smart outcomes. And then, you know, all of a sudden a disaster hits that obviously was a risk. You know, it was well known that it was a risk. And then insurance coverage just isn't available. And conversely, what can insurers do to, as we've talked about, really support some climate smart adaptations, ideally that would work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve resilience at the same time, in a way that's meaningful to insurers' bottom lines, as well as just the way we live. So I guess adding a bullet to talk about specific climate related risk factors that you're seeing or that we should be considering within the insurance context. Thanks.
Thanks. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's a serious point of frustration, you know, for a lot of people, and it's a point of pain for many of the communities. I mean, you've probably seen the presentations from my department on the number of non-renewals and the growth in the FAIR plan. And then also there's just the premium increases, and that has a major effect on people's lives. And, you know, achieving that gradual transition is very difficult. And I think that it's a good point of discussion for our crossover groups. And, you know, I'll just say that that's a good thing to add, and I'm happy to do that. You know, and it may be something where there's a combination. There's a lot of short-term issues here where insurance contracts tend to be for 1 year. Therefore, insurance pricing tends to only reflect that next year. And so that getting something that's more gradual may take figuring out how to not necessarily require a longer contract, but require somehow a longer look at the situation. So I think that's it's an area that's very, you know, I think important to me. So I think that's a really good comment. Thanks.
And I think it could be like a slate of risks, but a slate of potential that would increase rates, but then a slate of adaptations and measures that could qualify for discounts on those rates. Mm-hmm. And that can be applied to whatever year you're talking about, but sort of updated as we go along, and informed by, you know, these big disasters that we're seeing, but also informed by the climate science and the other data that insurance companies are very well versed in. So if maybe we could bifurcate those two things, the annual renewal from the underwriting risks and mitigations, that might be one thing to consider.
Mm-hmm. Great. No, thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Jenna. I am not seeing any other comments here specifically, hands raised specifically for this. So I'm going to hand it to Juliet here in 1 second, but I just want to make one kind of comment and observation too. And Janna, I really appreciate your comments, because I think one of the things that we are really trying to drive on this is that alignment. And how do we get out of the cycle where we're in that you described very well and very clearly, and trying to figure out how do we make sure local governments understand what those kind of carrots are, or, not just local governments, but people who are really trying to take kind of landscape scale action around reducing risk. And once we know what those are, how do we then get those reflected in insurance pricing and in the insurance market? And where we have found that we really need to start is this kind of 101 level of, or layer of space of even just understanding how do these processes work, and then ultimately driving to what you just described, Jenna. So really appreciate how you described that. So thank you. And I'll hand it over to Juliet.
Thanks. I think, yeah, and just to try to pull a little bit more out and thinking about the planning primer, which is where that would be the analog to the insurance primer, what are the questions that we on the planning side potentially think that the insurance folks need to understand? And I think to the presentation by Eric and Beth earlier, where they outlined, there's 3 different strategies that need to happen for fire safe planning, right? And one of those is that landscape scale. And so to getting to Nuantara's point and to what Janna, you were saying, what do we feel is important to include in the planning primer? Are there any thoughts on that? The subgroup is happy to take a first pass at it, but we want to see if there's some initial thoughts from this group that you think are really important to address there.
I'm not seeing any hands come up. I don't think. I might ask Jason, sorry, not to put you on the spot here, but recognizing you are on part of this work group, just if you have any initial thoughts that you think this planning primer could address or should cover.
Well, the one thing that I focused on when we met was the decision-making process on the front end for local governments, the upstream process for planning, if you're doing a specific plan in a city or even doing zoning regulations. What does a local government need to think about, and what do they think about right now when initiating a planning process for an area or a specific development proposal? I would wager that this is not on their minds. The insurability and the costs of insurability are not something that feature in the decision-making process very much at all. And arguably it should, especially given the issue of affordability over the long term. So I think it would be good on the planning primer to really fully understand if there are any jurisdictions, any cities, or any local planners that consider the cost of insurance or insurability right up front. That's the first thing that occurred to me, because in my experience, it's usually just sort of passed down to the end user. And maybe there should be a lot more upstream thought about that.
Great, thank you, Jason. I in the queue, I think we've got Laura and then Jonathan Parfrey.
Hi, yeah, I wanted to chime in here with a couple of thoughts. I thought a lot from a science perspective. We thought a lot about how various sort of science metrics or observations can actually feed into risk management. So there's a lot of work done, for sea level rise and various climate models that have to do with uncertainty, and that's definitely there's a lot of work in terms of reducing the amount of uncertainty, which helps also provide risk probability percentages, which definitely feed into, these kind of insurance models or calculations in terms of, how much risk are we willing to manage or accommodate. And so I think with with the advances in regional downscale and climate model, we're actually kind of on that cusp of being able to really have this solid conversation, which is great. I also find that that planning may not actually be the avenue for some of this, because risk management really is taken on mostly by sort of the construction managers, the public works, the finance, the CFOs within the agencies. And so some of the discussion really needs to be there when it comes to capital improvements, whether it's, building a seawall or elevating a bridge to accommodate certain flows. All of these things have a risk calculation, and some of that is really tied to, for local governments, what's important is it's tied to, their capital investment plans. And those capital investment plans are also on a timeline, and then the planning kind of backs up to those. And what's critical is that the lifespan and lifetime of these capital investments also needs to be reconsidered. It may be that elevating a bridge only works for 30 years because we anticipate that flooding is going to overtake it. And that's okay, because the risk reduction for those 30 years is something that is a great benefit, is a better benefit than a no action. So when we're looking at climate adaptations, we're starting to do this calculation of not just like, what's the, you know, how do the costs and benefits weigh of proposal A versus proposal B, but also versus no action. And so I think that really ultimately plays into the formulas that go into understanding insurance and risk. Is you have to also use no action as one of your sort of you know, options on the table, and then sort of calculate from there. So it's just a few thoughts from me.
That's great. I guess one quick question, just follow on that to Jason and Juliet, as you guys are thinking about the planning primer. I think, Laura, your point of, you know, where maybe our heads have been in the general plan, kind of long range planning space, but in addition to that, because I think there is an important role there, but kind of that continuum to the asset investment side of things, and thinking about including, you know, CIPs and some of the, like, how does the plan get translated into actual investments? And if that could be part of this primer, I think maybe that would help make the bridge that Laura just importantly highlighted.
Right, because if you don't have those folks at the table, you're almost going to have to like reset the conversation and then go back and change your sort of planning horizon, because a planning horizon does calculate sort of like how long does it take for us to get the finances or design this or get the permitting, and all of those components are really related to that, like everyone's agreement on the lifetime and the lifespan and the resilience of that asset. So if you should have that conversation almost first and then kind of back it up.
Great, thank you. Sorry, Jonathan, to jump in there, but hand it to you.
Oh, thanks so much. You know, I think of the California Earthquake Authority and how they have this robust brace and bolt program. Not robust enough. They only, I think, allocate around $5 million a year to help Californians protect their homes against earthquake. But that very model of insurance entities getting involved ahead of the problem as a way of mitigating, a way of preventing some of the worst harm ahead of time so that they benefit on the back end. And I think a lot of us have been thinking this way about insurance. And I have to be candid, we've been exploring any variety of means, and I just want to applaud Mike and insurance commissioner and his team with the work groups, many of the people who are on this call right now, for exploring these concepts of how do you make that economic argument to do preventive measures up front. But if I were at a city, I would put these investments, if it was even a captive insurance project that the city or the county or an assembly of cities and counties put together, I would almost like weigh that against maybe even a taxation. So I think in protecting the people within your jurisdiction, insurance, I think, could be one tool. But what we found in our explorations is that it could be somewhat limited, and gaining some revenue through, let's say, tax increment financing or something else like that, I think might be a more fruitful area to explore, or they should both be explored. But if I were the head of, if I was in city government, I would want to explore a number of options and not just rely entirely on insurance. Which is a long-winded way of saying that in the product that you're developing right now, I think it's important to provide that context that there are other ways of getting revenue than making an economic argument to insurance companies to put money up front.
Yes, great. Thank you, Jonathan. Agree, very important. And Mike, did you want to weigh in?
Oh, I would just say I totally agree with Jonathan. I think most ways, sorry, not most ways, but several paths could converge. And I think there's also a way to kind of propose things like that that allow us to better understand the best path forward. Because, you know, in some instances in the Southeast, insurance companies, you know, either put money into funds for new roofs that are hurricane rated, or offer, you know, significant incentives for that. And part of that is the nature of those risks, but part of it is that there's a lot of work that's gone into figuring out what's effective and what's not, and what's, you know, going to incentivize behavioral change and what's not. And I think what Jonathan mentioned of having, you know, kind of a couple different ways to get at that does help develop, you know, policy. So anyway, I just want to say that I thought that was a good idea.
Great. Juliet, I'm not seeing any other comments here in the queue. Am I missing anything?
Nope, that's it. I might just throw this last one up just to see if it pings anyone, and anyone last wants to speak on this from the council. Thinking about that, we're talking really about the landscape scale strategies, and if there are some initial considerations, but you'll have another opportunity to talk about this at the next March meeting. So I'm going to give the last chance. Okay.
All right, great. So then on the next slide, you have the timeline here. Great. So then we'll expect something coming back in terms of progress for the work group at the next meeting in March, and have a chance to weigh in here. Anything else you want to highlight on the timeline, Juliet?
Nope, I think that's where we are right now. Just to make sure I wasn't muted. No, I mean, there's always the opportunity to provide comments now, but no, we'll be back with more for people to dig into.
Great, thank you. So I will hand it back to you to move to the next portion here to talk about the resilience metric work group work.
Okay, and we take the public comment at the end of the item.
Yeah, we'll take public comment on both at the end.
Okay, great. So the other big piece that is being brought back up has been percolating since the inception of ICARP. You all have been very busy for several years, just establishing ICARP, establishing the council, getting the principles. There's been a lot of work with the foundational pieces of ICARP. And then the thing that has been sort of percolating throughout is this need for resilience metrics. So previously, hold on, I see all of me on this in front of the slides. Give me 1 second. So as part of the work plan for this year, resilience metrics came back up to the top. And so there was an initial meeting in June to start focusing in on this. And that was where, again, it was another one of these kind of level setting conversations where you talked about different definitions for indicators and metrics. There was a lot of conversation on what is the appropriate scale. This is an interagency body and a local and regional body that talks to the state and vice versa. So what is the right scale for thinking about these metrics? There were some great presentations from people from New York, from some of the state work that's done here, from the Tahoe Conservancy, from some of the state agencies, the California Energy Commission, OEHA. And so there was an opportunity to really learn from what other people are doing. The thing that kind of came out of that was that there was this goal to think about this from a systems approach, to be looking at the built, the natural, and the social systems. So those were the big conversation points that came out from that first meeting, with also the recognition that we don't want I always say it backwards, the perfect to be the enemy of the good, right? So recognizing that there's a lot of great work out there to measure stuff, but we don't have all the measures that we want, especially when it comes to the more social aspects like adaptive capacity, et cetera. And we don't want that to hold us up. We recognize there will be some gaps, and that was part of what was identified in that first meeting. One of the prior fellows worked with the ICARP team, did a little white paper, or big white paper that tried to combine all of these into a written form, and looked at the definitions, reviewed the existing state of resilience and climate metrics. And there's a lot out there. Everyone is talking about this. Everyone is kind of trying to figure out how to grapple with metrics. There was a literature review, and even since then, there have been websites that have come out, resiliencemetrics.org. I mean, this is really something that across the board, people are trying to figure out, how do we show movement towards or progress towards risk reduction and building resilience. So really what we're going to do today is just lay out how we propose to move forward. We'd love to have some conversation about what you've been hearing in your respective worlds about resilience metrics. Do you have resilience metrics that you're using? What do you think is really important to bring to the conversation? But we wanted to lay out this process and see if this jives with the group. We anticipate having 2 working group meetings, one in January and one in February. This is open to all the council members, so we'll send the dates. But the first step will be just really narrowing down on what's the purpose of these metrics. What do we think that they really need to achieve? And what are some of the initial indicators? We will bring that back to the TAC, the full TAC for whomever can't participate in the working group meetings, to have a conversation with the council. And then at that point, hopefully we'll also be starting down the road with the update of the state adaptation strategy, because ultimately these 2 processes need to connect. And so at that point, we'll be able to have a conversation about what we've been talking about at the ICARP council scale, and then where the state is sort of heading. Tara at the beginning mentioned that we're also sort of reconvening the interagency work groups. And so we'll be able to learn from all the different agencies within the state about what they're looking to measure and how they're trying to track their progress in risk reduction and resilience. So all of that will start to come together in the spring. In the working groups in between the March and the June TAC, we're hoping to really try to then dig into what the indicators are and then start to identify the metrics. We'll bring it back to the council to have a group discussion. And then in the summer, we're hoping to be able to have it far enough along that we can bring it to some stakeholder engagement workshops throughout the summer. Ideally in person, we'll see, but and to really put them out into the community and try to get feedback about what they're doing to measure resilience. Does this resonate? I think one of the things that was talked about in the June meeting was, is this ground up? Is this top down? And the conversation really focused on, no, well, yes, it's all of those, right? That we want it to be useful at the local or regional scale, but then also be something that can show overall progress at the state level. And then ideally, if everything continues to truck along as planned, by September, we have a draft set of resilience metrics that we put out there, again, with that concept of knowing that we're not going to get it right the first time. We're going to get it as close as we can. There's going to be data that we don't have yet. And so part of the process will also be identifying what is it that we think we need to understand better. How do we go about measuring that? What do we need to do to advance, kind of trying to figure out how to measure those things. So that's the proposed process. It's pretty intense, but we can do it. And so the path forward is we'll have our first working group meeting on January 20th. And in advance of that, we want to do some pre-work. So we are going to send around a survey. These questions may shift a little, and actually we'd love some feedback on these questions, but we want to collect from this group. We'll send it out on the ICARP listserv as well. But we just want to hear in California, what are people doing? Why are they doing metrics if they are? Why are they measuring resilience? How are they doing it? If they're not doing it, have they heard that their neighbor has some great metric that they want to use one day? We want to collect all of that and have it be California specific. There are a ton of databases out there that have any number of metrics that you could want, but we want to start with what people are currently measuring and adapting that to how we would potentially move forward as a state. Just note that your responses will be public, so be aware. And that's really the goal of today's discussion on resilience, and just to sort of put this process out there and see if just have some conversation around, does this sound like the right path forward? And what are you all experiencing right now in the space of resilience metrics? So I see a couple of hands already. So Tara, do you want me to turn it
Yeah.
to you? Okay.
Yes, I've been tracking while you're presenting. I'm tracking the hand raising. So I know it's hard to do both at the same time. So yes, thank you, Juliet, for that. I think queued up, it's Amanda, Carolee, and then John Wentworth as the next to kick us off here.
Thanks, Sue and Tara and Juliet. I am excited about this work, and I think I'm really supportive of the pre-meeting survey approach, just so that you have you can sort of take the pulse of where we're all at before we convene. I just have sort of two immediate thoughts that I would like to just share. The first is just I would like us to avoid a situation where we get into a conversation around purpose that that takes away from too much of the conversation around what the actual metrics are. In other words, the purpose really, I would hope we all agree, is to foster our ability to really drive toward shared goals and track our progress. So I just think the more expansive we can be about that purpose, the better off we will be, and the more of our time should be focused on what those metrics are and how they can be developed in such a way that is that are credible and meaningful, but not overly prescriptive. And then the second point I wanted to flag is I think I really appreciate the approach of looking to see what already exists and ensuring that we don't inadvertently reinvent any wheels. So just want to really underscore my appreciation for that approach. And that is all. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. Carolee?
Great. I want to concur with Amanda's comments about purpose. I agree that is the purpose. And just so you know how we're experiencing this, we are working currently to expand our Beacon program, which has been a 10-year program that has been funded through the Public Utilities Goods Charge. We are looking to expand it to include adaptation and resilience efforts. So for 10 years, we've been tracking cities and counties and their efforts on the climate mitigation, and we have kind of a measurement system and a recognition system in place for local governments, which I believe have really drives their work in that realm. And now we really want to put that forward for adaptation and resilience. We're working on a couple of local climate adaptation and resilience plans right now. And I will tell you the struggle is for those metrics. So the communities are demanding that these be part of climate action plans. They're a little bit kind of over adaptation or mitigation strategies and really want to focus on adaptation and what that means for their communities. And so we're looking at trying to put some metrics to it so that these plans have quantifiable greenhouse gas reductions, but also get the communities and reflect their values around adaptation and resilience. So as Juliet and I talked about, I'm very passionate about this. Would love to fast track it as much as possible because we want to include this in our Beacon program in 2021. We know there might be an interim type recognition system, but we are very anxious for this, and so are local governments across the state.
That's great. Lots of fun to think about that connection there. So thank you. I think next up we had John Wentworth, then Laura.
Good afternoon, everybody. My understanding is that the executive branch of the federal government is going through some kind of a transition in the coming weeks. And in the interests of not isolating ourselves from our federal partners, which may be kind of an abrupt change requiring a lot of medication and those kinds of things, that we really seek to look at, to Amanda's point, what existing metrics may still be lying around in the federal government and make sure we align ourselves to those. This will be critically important to create functional alignments between the state of California and our federal partners, especially the land management space and the value of all the federal landscape in the state, and make sure that we have those meetings and those discussions while talking apples to apples and not apples to whatever we've been trying to talk to for the last 4 years. Thank you. Please excuse the editorial comment. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. And Laura.
I guess from just glancing at this, I know that there's been the circle of discussion of what do we mean by resilience metrics, and the definition is always just like but it is kind of relevant to like what outcomes are important for measuring resilience, because I think what's different about mitigation versus resilience is mitigation, you've got kind of a hard target of greenhouse gas emission reductions, but resilience is, based on the timeline and the stressors of that timeline. And so it's kind of hard. So it's tough. There's sort of like, if you want to think about it in the adaptation space, is there, like I always think like immediate, near-term, long-term actions that need to be taken at this point in time. So can you think about resilience there? Because the unfortunate part is that local governments aren't going to be able to check a box and be like, we did that, so now we're resilient. It's like, well, now you're resilient for maybe the next 8 or 10 years, and then things might change after that. So yeah, I know it's a tough one. So there's resilience to weather systems, and we kind of know how to do that. And then there's we know what species heat thresholds are, but we don't know what I don't know how to define human heat thresholds. And so it's a tough space. But anyways, my comment or suggestion is just make sure when you're sending out that survey that you really articulate the questions in a way that people kind of understand what you're trying to get to. Otherwise, your responses might just be way all over the place, and that might be really hard to handle.
That's great. Very helpful. Brian, I see your hand is up next.
Yeah, thanks. No, I just wanted to follow up on that. I think this is great. I'm really excited after all these years that we're actually starting to have some real indicators, or we're beginning to develop indicators. I would just want to just put out there that in our, we worked on developing various indicators. A lot of cities are developing equity indicators, and there can be a lot of, and then we have health indicators. There can be a lot of overlap. So I just think we have to be careful how prescriptive we are, and it may be that we want to focus a little bit more on process or the thinking that's going behind what's being done, or how you're approaching the creation of your indicators and the measuring of what applies to your particular community. We did actually work with ARUP a couple years ago, and they had 300 resilient indicator questions. Half of them were quantitative, the other half were qualitative. It took a lot of effort and work to put it together, and I don't know how useful it was in the end. So I think we just have to be careful what we're asking for, and be mindful that each community will sort of interpret resilience slightly differently. So that's going to require flexibility. Having said that, I really think it's important that we have some critical items that we can really look at across the state, from community to community. So that's it. But I'm looking forward to the working group, and I think the pre-meeting survey is a good idea as well. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions from council members? Juliet, anything else? Any responses or follow-up questions that you have based on the feedback we've gotten already?
No, just underscoring that this will be fun. Some people are mentioning some different resilience indicators that are out there, NAACP, and then Los Angeles has cooling targets. So all of these comments that are coming in. We know we don't let you talk to anybody but the host. So we're taking note of those and have those, and we'll bring those also. And yeah, I think just please, when the survey comes, don't stress too much about it. Just please get the thoughts down, because the sooner we get it in, the quicker we can parse through it all. So thank you. And yeah, no, I think that's pretty much it. So we're excited to dig in.
Great. I think one just quick process reminder for everybody, as with all of the these kind of broader work group efforts, they are come one, come all. So the work group meeting that will be January 20th that Juliet has listed up here is, excuse me, is going to be open to all the council members. So don't feel like you have missed something. You will already be invited to the work group, and please join as you can when that comes out. So when the invite comes out. So just a quick reminder for how our work group sessions work out. So Juliet, anything else for on this agenda item, either the insurance or resilience metrics work group?
Nope, I think at this point we've covered what we can.
Great. Then are there any comments from the public or questions? All right, seeing none, we will move on to the next agenda item. I think we are going to end up wrapping up this meeting a little bit early, which is probably welcome on a Friday after a day-long Zoom meeting. So I will just turn here. Are there any general public comments? Anything anybody wants to raise, questions on anything that has been on the agenda or otherwise? We'll give people a second. All right, seeing none, we can move on to the next agenda item, which is just a quick wrap up, closing and talking about future agenda items and meetings. So our next meetings, and Juliet, I can't remember. Oh, we do have slides. Yeah. Okay, great. So we are looking at, we haven't sent out invites to council members for the next meetings, but we wanted to let you all know what we were thinking in terms of the quarterly meeting schedule, sticking with our regular quarterly sessions in March, June, September, and December. We have tried to work around some of the major events that we know will be coming down the line for next year, including Climate Week and the COP, assuming all these things still happen in person in this next year. But if you do have know of any major events or conflicts that we should be aware of that could affect these meeting dates, please let us know. But that's the arc for our meeting schedule in 2021. The March meeting, I talked about this a little bit at the very beginning of the meeting, but just a reminder, at our March meeting, we'll be bringing back our substantive work items for feedback, discussion, and input. But we also want to, as we did this year, I'm already in 2021, but as we did in March, we will be teeing up a conversation around our priorities as a council for 2021. So just a heads up that will be coming along as part of that meeting. Then for the next meetings, just a recap, Juliet already talked about this, but we will have that resilience work group meeting in January, and then one in February, and then the insurance working group, the kind of partnership with CDI, is also going to meet in between this and the March meetings. So just a reminder there. Last thing on my side is just a reminder about appointments. As with every year, at the end of the calendar year, we come to the appointments portion of the year. So many have asked if you are continuing on the council. We, just as a reminder, we have transitioned our very first year with the council. We had 1-year terms. We have now transitioned over the last couple of years to 2-year terms. We will be letting you all know where you are in terms of, are you at the end of a 2-year term or middle of a 2-year term? So we will send that out and let you all know, just in case you aren't can't remember. For a couple of you who have been reappointed a couple times, the years may have blended together. So we'll send that out. If you are coming to the end of your 2-year term and you are interested in staying on, we would also love to know that. We cannot, make any guarantees in terms of the appointment final appointment decisions. Those decisions are made by the OPR director, but we would love to know if people who are coming to the end of their term are interested in staying on. We will be, for people who are coming to the end of the 2-year term, we will be sending out appointments in January. So we're going to be looking at the composition of the council as we do with every year. We really want to make sure that we have got the right voices at the table, recognizing even with a council of our size of, I think we're this year at 24. So we are a large and mighty council, but, even with that, we fully recognize there are, California is a very diverse, very large state, and it is difficult to make sure we have all the right voices at the table at the right time. But this, at the end of each year, we have the opportunity to evaluate who's with us, who isn't, and what voices do we need to bring into the fold more directly. So we'll be going through that process, and we'll be updating appointments in January. So I think that is it from our side. We just want to say thank you to everybody very much. I hope everybody is staying healthy and safe, and yes, and has a good end to 2020. I guess I will open it up just if there are any final comments from council members before we sign off here. Not seeing any. Thank you. Appreciate all that you do. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Everyone cover their faces.
Thank you.
Social
Thanks,
distance.
everyone. Thanks, Tara and Juliet. And have a good holiday.
Thank you.